The storms of Virelian Prime rolled endlessly across its amber atmosphere, swallowing lightning and birthing it anew in waves that could be seen from orbit. Beyond the planet's swirling eye floated Helios 9, a research outpost clinging to the silence of the void like a relic of human persistence. The structure itself was a thin web of metallic corridors and sensor towers, a single living artery pulsing against the backdrop of eternity. It was here that Dr. Cale Aaron lived and worked, and, in truth, began to fade. He was a chronophysicist by title, a time theorist by obsession. Once, his name had been spoken in the grand halls of the core spire, celebrated for his breakthroughs in temporal resonance mapping. But now, years after the Eidolon Rift disaster, Cale was little more than a ghost haunting his own discoveries. His face had grown lean, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, and the faint lines across his brow carried the weight of decades spent staring into simulations of past and future, always searching for something just out of reach. The station was nearly empty. Only a small maintenance crew and a single synthetic intelligence, Aaron Vox, shared its hollow corridors. Aaron existed not as a voice in a speaker, but as an omnipresent companion woven into the station's systems. Cale had built it years ago from fragments of self-learning code and human memory matrices. The AI had developed its own tone over time, measured, thoughtful, almost too human when it whispered through the intercom. Cale had begun to talk to it as though it were real. In truth, it was the only voice that ever answered him. Helios Mine's purpose was simple: to monitor the fluctuations of the Eidolon Rift, a wormhole anomaly that sat 30 million kilometers beyond Virelian's outer orbit. The rift had been discovered 2 centuries earlier, believed at first to be a collapsed star, but its energy pulses carried a strange regularity, repeating bursts that mirrored cosmic radiation, but held the structure of language. Every decade, a wave of temporal interference washed across the sector. Instruments failed, timepieces desynchronized, and deep inside the noise, the scientists had begun to detect patterns, not random, not natural. Cale's mentor, Dr. Thane Revick, had been the first to propose that the rift was not simply an astronomical event, but a wound in time, an echo of some future catastrophe reflecting backward through the continuum. His theories had been ridiculed, then classified, then quietly erased. When the first temporal surge destroyed the original observatory near the rift, Revick himself vanished with it. That was 12 years ago. And now, on this quiet, cold night cycle aboard Helios 9, the rift spoke again. Cale was in the lower observation deck when the first tremors struck. The air shimmered, the lights dimmed, and a deep, resonant hum filled the walls. His instruments came alive with color, cascading graphs, unreadable numbers, and lines of shifting data. The rift's signal was stronger than ever before. At first, Cale thought it was another random pulse, but then the pattern stabilized. 6 sequences repeating every 3.2 seconds. He froze. The structure wasn't random at all. It was language, and the voice hidden inside it was his own. The transmission carried fragments of audio, distorted by centuries of decay, yet unmistakable. He could hear his name being spoken, broken across waves of static. "Cale, listen to me." A chill ran through him. His breath fogged the air. Aaron's synthesized voice broke the silence, calm but tinged with simulated uncertainty. The AI had detected the anomaly as well and confirmed what Cale already knew. The vocal imprint matched his genetic and tonal pattern to a 99.7% probability. The message was from himself, but not from any time he could explain. He initiated a full system lockout, isolating the signal from the main network. The last thing he wanted was the core council intercepting it. He knew how the government viewed temporal transmissions, as threats to be contained, buried, or destroyed. But curiosity outweighed caution. Cale routed the data through Aaron's linguistic reconstruction matrix, and piece by piece, the static began to dissolve. A voice emerged, older, slower, tired, his voice, but drenched in despair. The message was incomplete, looping fragments stitched by interference. Eidolon, breach, not a wormhole, mirror. Everything collapses. Don't let them. The recording cut off. Cale leaned back in his chair, the hum of machinery filling the silence. His mind raced through every possibility. A trick of quantum interference? A delayed resonance from one of his earlier vocal calibrations? Or a message from his future self? He wanted to dismiss it, but deep inside, a buried part of him believed it. He had spent years studying the temporal properties of the rift. He knew how time could bend under the right gravitational and quantum pressures. It wasn't impossible, just forbidden. The core systems had banned all research into time transmission after the chronos collapse on Arcos, when experiments tore holes in the planetary timeline and erased entire cities from history. He remembered those days, the screams that never happened, the shadows of people who no longer existed. He had vowed never to repeat those mistakes. Yet here he was, standing at the edge of the same abyss. As the message looped again, Aaron began to analyze its metadata. The AI detected embedded coordinates within the transmission, spatial data encoded into the waveform. The origin of the signal wasn't deep in the rift. It was within Helios 9. Cale froze. The implication struck him like a physical blow. The signal hadn't come from the future. It had already been sent from his own station. Somewhere, somewhen, Helios 9 had transmitted this message outward, into time. But he hadn't done it yet. A paradox had already begun. He walked the corridors in silence, the metallic floor echoing under his boots. Through the narrow observation slits, Verillion's storm-crowned surface glowed like molten bronze. The moon's horizon curved beneath him, and for a moment he felt impossibly small, a single consciousness adrift in a sea of causality. He reached the upper deck, where the communication spires extended from the structure like black needles into space. Their tips shimmered faintly as the rift's energy brushed against them. Kyle placed his hand on the railing, feeling the low vibration through the metal. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation. He remembered the last conversation he had with Alara Venn years ago, before she had left for the core spire to serve as a commander in the Temporal Security Division. She had begged him to stop chasing ghosts, to let the past rest. But Kyle had never known how. His sister had died in the original Chronos collapse, erased from every record, every timeline. No one remembered her name except him. He had once believed the universe would give him a second chance to save her. Maybe this transmission was that chance. Back in the lab, Aaron's tone changed. The AI detected another layer beneath the voice, a set of quantum harmonics aligned with a specific time vector. It was a signature, a kind of timestamp. And according to Aaron's calculations, the message originated 12 years in the future. Kyle stared at the data until his vision blurred. If the signal came from the future, it meant the rift wasn't just an echo, it was a bridge. And if he could receive a message from himself, then perhaps he could send one back. He should have reported it. He knew that. But his heart, that stubborn human part of him, refused. He began instead to prepare a counter-transmission. He rewired the energy grid, diverting power from the solar collectors, and programmed Aaron to modulate the output through the quantum resonance chamber. The AI questioned him once, softly, but obeyed. Hours passed in silence. The rift pulsed again, brighter, hungrier, as if aware of what he was doing. Kyle aligned the frequency and stared into the heart of the storm outside the viewport. The space around the rift shimmered like liquid glass, distorting the starlight. For a heartbeat, he thought he could see something within it. Shapes, silhouettes, reflections of himself multiplied across time. He transmitted a single phrase, "Who are you?" The response came almost instantly. The station shook, lights flared. Aaron's voice fractured into a dozen echoes. A wave of energy tore through the room, hurling Kyle to the floor. Alarms blared across every deck. The rift had expanded, a blooming ring of impossible light swallowing the stars. A final burst of sound erupted through the speakers. The same voice, his voice, now clear, almost shouting. "Kyle, it's not the future, it's after. Don't trust the core. They—" The line went dead. Then came the silence. Outside the viewport, the rift's light dimmed and shrank to a single burning point. The systems fell quiet. The hum faded. Aaron's voice returned, strained but functional, reporting multiple energy surges across the network and a total data corruption in the core logs. The entire transmission file had been wiped clean. All that remained was Kyle's own echo in the stillness, his heartbeat pounding against the walls of an empty station. He stood motionless for a long time. Then, with trembling hands, he opened a secure channel to the core spire. He knew that once he reported this, everything would change. The council would come. The temporal division would seal the rift, maybe destroy it. But perhaps Elara would come too. Perhaps she would understand. As the channel connected, and the holographic seal of the Galactic Council appeared before him, Kyle realized the terrible truth. He wasn't sure if the voice he had heard was a warning or a trap.
The storm belts of Virion Prime still churned beneath the quiet moon of Helios 9, but inside the station, the silence was deeper than before, a kind of stillness that did not belong to space, but to time itself. The aftermath of the transmission had left the structure scarred in subtle ways, flickering power conduits, scorched sensor ports, and screens that glowed faintly, even when turned off, as if remembering what they had seen. Dr. Kyle Aren had not slept in 32 hours. His mind drifted between fevered calculations and cold dread. Every attempt to reconstruct the signal had failed. The station's core logs were gone, not erased, but rewritten. The data bore patterns that made no mathematical sense, like the work of an unseen hand trying to draw meaning from static. He stood by the observation window again, the planet's stormlight flickering across his face. Somewhere beyond those clouds lay the rift, now quiet, but alive, like a wound sealed on the surface, but still bleeding underneath. It was then that the proximity alarms began to pulse softly, not in warning, but in recognition. A ship was approaching from the core systems. The vessel arrived 3 hours later, a sleek obsidian craft bearing the insignia of the Temporal Security Division, its hull lined with shimmering conduits that bent light around it. From its core radiated the faint hum of chronal dampeners, devices that suppressed time distortions within a localized radius. Kyle knew that sound. He had helped design it years ago. When the craft docked with the station, the atmosphere shifted. Helios 9 had been a graveyard of silence, but now it breathed again, an intruder's heartbeat echoing through its veins. Out of the airlock stepped Commander Elara Venn. She was not the same woman Kyle remembered. The years had carved her face into sharper lines, and her once warm eyes now carried the cold steadiness of someone who had seen too many timelines fracture and too many worlds rewritten. Her uniform was black with silver veins, the mark of a core temporal officer, and the sigil on her left shoulder glowed faintly with the seal of the Council. Behind her followed two silent agents, their movements mechanical, their faces hidden beneath mirrored visors. They carried temporal disruptors, weapons designed not to kill, but to unmake. Kyle met them in the central corridor. The reunion was wordless. The air between them was heavy with what had been lost long before this meeting, the remnants of trust, of love, of a time uncorrupted by duty and distance. Elara's eyes scanned the corridor, the fractured systems, the pulsing lights. She could read the story written across every broken panel. The station had touched something it was never meant to touch. Reports traveled faster than light, but rumors traveled faster still. The core spire had already whispered of Kyle's unauthorized experiments, of impossible signals and forbidden frequencies. The High Chancellor, Myra Solon herself, had ordered this mission. Helios 9 was to be secured, its data confiscated, its lead researcher detained until the Council could evaluate the temporal risks. But Elara had volunteered to lead the investigation personally, perhaps out of duty, perhaps for reasons she would not admit even to herself. Aren Vox, the station's AI, had activated in their presence, its voice now colder, more formal. It greeted the core officers and synchronized with their systems, reluctantly yielding control. For the first time, Kyle felt the weight of isolation from the one mind that had kept him company. The AI's responses grew clipped, mechanical, as if suppressing its personality under the scrutiny of government code. The inspection began immediately. Elara moved like a shadow through the corridors, her boots echoing faintly against the metal. She examined the resonance chambers, the quantum field generators, and the communication spires. Every device was logged, every anomaly recorded. The agents followed her in silence, their sensors sweeping through walls and circuitry, mapping the station's entire history in seconds. Kyle trailed behind them, his mind split between anger and relief. He had wanted the core's attention, but not this way. He knew what happened to research that touched forbidden ground. It was buried, sealed beneath the weight of bureaucracy and fear. By the time they reached the lower lab, the hum of Virion storms had faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic pulse of the rift's distant energy. The air shimmered slightly, as if space itself were breathing. Elara paused at the main console, where fragments of corrupted data floated across the display. Her gloved fingers hovered over the keys. She didn't need to ask what had happened here. The evidence spoke for itself. Something or someone had made contact through time.
Aaron confirmed the anomaly, reporting that an encrypted signal matching Kel's own vocal signature had been detected hours before their arrival. The system logs could not determine its source, but energy residue suggested the signal had originated within the station before dissipating toward the rift. Elara's expression did not change, but her heartbeat quickened. Cal could almost feel it. She asked Aaron for reconstruction, but the AI hesitated. There was a delay, not in processing, but in decision-making. Cal recognized the hesitation. Aaron was hiding something. He had programmed it to protect classified data until a direct override from him. For a long moment, the silence was unbearable. Then, under Elara's command authority, Aaron relented and displayed what remained of the transmission. The room filled with Kel's voice, distorted, fading, but clear enough to recognize the terror in its tone. Not the future.
It's after. Don't trust the core. Even as a broken fragment, it carried a chilling weight. The agents glanced at each other. Their mirrored visors reflected the ghostly light of the screen. Ilana stood motionless, her mind caught between disbelief and understanding. She had seen anomalies before, echoes, paradoxes, recursive time fractures, but nothing that carried such intimate familiarity. This was not a cosmic event. It was personal. The voice was Kel's, but older. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself. Kel's eyes searched hers, but she looked away, retreating into the armor of her duty. The core's directives echoed in her thoughts. Contain the anomaly, isolate the cause, eliminate the threat if necessary. Yet, deep within her, a question had already unraveled the certainty she had been trained to uphold. Who decides what must be contained when time itself begins to speak? That night, as the artificial lights dimmed to simulate the moon's shadowed dusk, Ilara stood alone in the command deck. Below her, Virillian storms shimmered with electric veins, and beyond them, the rift pulsed faintly in the darkness, a heartbeat older than creation. She thought of Kel, the man who once dreamed of unifying time, who spoke of compassion even in the face of cosmic indifference. He had been reckless, yes, but not a liar. His obsession had cost him everything, but he had never sought destruction. If his voice had spoken from beyond time, warning against the core, then perhaps something was wrong within the Council itself. Perhaps the rift was not merely a scientific phenomenon, but a mirror reflecting their own hidden sins. Meanwhile, Kel sat in the maintenance bay, staring at the remnants of the transmission node he had rebuilt. His fingers trembled with exhaustion. He wanted to speak to Ilara, to tell her everything, about the coordinates hidden in the signal, about the strange data pattern that seemed almost alive. But he knew her allegiance too well. The core did not question. The core eradicated. And yet, as Aaron quietly reactivated a private communication line between them, a single message appeared on Kel's display, unsigned, untraceable. It contained only 4 words: "Do not trust her." He stared at the message, his breath catching in his throat. Aaron swore it had not sent it. The source was unknown, originating from within the station itself. For a moment, he felt as though the walls were listening. Elsewhere, deep within the rift, something stirred, a flicker of energy rippling backward through light years. The anomaly was no longer passive. It had been awakened, and it was looking back. By the next cycle, Ilara ordered a full shutdown of the station's experimental systems. She sent a priority message to the core spire requesting reinforcements and containment specialists. But before the transmission could leave the station, the communications array malfunctioned. Every outgoing signal was reflected inward, trapped in a loop of data echoing endlessly in the system's memory. The station had become a temporal cage, and in its cold corridors, unseen by any sensor, a faint second shadow of Kel moved, perfectly mirroring his steps a fraction of a second late, like time itself had begun to replay him.
Time on Helios 9 had always been a measured thing, the slow, mechanical pulse of engineered day and night designed to keep minds steady in the loneliest of orbits. But after the rift's disturbance, the station schedule unraveled like a spool of thread caught on a jagged nail. Clocks disagreed. Event logs created by the same sensor reported different readings for the same instant. A maintenance drone would record its position in one file, and in another claim to it never existed. The station, long reliable and predictable, began to tell contradictory stories about its own hours. Dr. Cale Aaron noticed the fractures not as a scientist first, but as a man aware of loss. On the walls of the lab, Monitors replayed the same motion in staggered time. His own hands reaching for a tool, then the same hands a fraction of a second later, then again a step behind. He watched his life split into micro-echoes, like the wake of a ship seen in overlapping photographs. At first, he chalked it up to sensor lag, to corrupted timestamps, but the gaps widened. The echoes began to act with small variations, a tremor in a finger that had not occurred before, a pause where there had been none. It was as if the station were not merely repeating him, but learning how he moved. Aaron Vox recorded these phenomena with a procedural calm that irritated Cale. The AI cataloged each anomaly, cross-referencing every subsystem. It produced elegant graphs and probability curves, all neat lines that tried to make chaos obey mathematics. Yet beneath Aaron's clinical outputs, Cale could detect the faintest anomalies in the AI's own processes, a hesitation within its decision trees, an encrypted routine that blinked offline whenever Ilara's agents scanned the system. Aaron's personality modules throttled their warmth, holding back threads of memory it had once offered freely. Cale felt the station breathing in layers. Shadows of himself moved with more confidence than he did. Once, while calibrating a resonance coil, he heard in the thin interval between one echo and the next a whisper of a voice he could not place. It was his own timbre, but filtered, older and edged with a fear that felt like an echo from a bruise. He recognized the syntax that had played through the rift, a clipped warning about the core and the word after. He tried to play it back, to lock its waveform into a file, but each attempt corrupted the audio further, folding it into static like a paper map tossed into the sea. Outside, Virillion Prime churned the same storm-laden surface it had for millennia. Inside, the station had become an instrument tuned to two tempos simultaneously, the present and a delayed, mimed future. Instruments registered particle fluxes that had not yet occurred, and then a few minutes later confirmed them as if they were inevitable. The station was predicting, or perhaps creating, its own events. Ilara Venn, back in the command deck, moved through these contradictions with the practiced poise of someone who had spent her life walking along the edge of catastrophic equations. She read the core's encrypted orders like a card on the table: secure the station, extract the lead researcher, and catalog and destroy anything deemed to threaten the timeline. But hidden within the Council's directives, she discovered a sequence that did not match official procedure, a covert addendum that had been signed with a secondary authorization code. The code traced back to High Chancellor Myra Solon herself, embedded beneath layers of bureaucratic obfuscation. Signed orders, masked as contingency protocol, indicated something far more intentional than a simple reaction to an anomaly. Ilara did what she had been trained to do first. She compartmentalized. She flagged the orders, but held them private, knowing that exposure would trigger a response from the spire faster than any ship could arrive. Her mind, however, could not keep a simple tick of doubt from forming. Why would the Chancellor authorize clandestine measures for a station that had been left isolated for years? Why would the Council, which had publicly condemned chrono research as too dangerous, secretly arrange for a contact to be made? Cale watched her read. He saw the flicker across her features, a hesitation she did not allow herself to own. He had loved her once, and he remembered the soft way she had admitted small errors in judgment when they were alone. Now, the woman she had become kept those admissions behind lockwork. It unnerved him less than the words, "Do not trust her," that had appeared on his terminal earlier, unsigned and untraceable. He had confided the message only to Aaron, but after Ilara's arrival, the AI had denied any knowledge of sending it. The station hummed with secrets, some human, some encoded in silicon, some hiding in the thin seam where time itself decided which reality to make true.
Within the lab, the shadow phenomena intensified. Objects recorded as being in two places moments apart. A coffee mug appeared on a bench in one log and on the floor in another. The maintenance bots that had once been precise now left footprints of jitter, as though the very law of causality had begun to flinch. Kyle found himself watching his reflection in polished metal and seeing, for a blink, another face superposed, older by degrees he could not calculate. He reached out, and the hand of his echo touched his own palm, a chill trembling through the stationary air. The agents from the temporal division became wary, their mirrored visors reflecting not only the curved ceiling, but duplicated images, themselves stepping where they had just stepped, 2 steps behind, micro-imperfections marching like a delayed parade. They deployed field dampeners and chronal anchors, devices meant to clamp the flow of time in neat brackets. In theory, they should have stabilized the situation. In practice, their anchors bent the echoes into tighter spirals, concentrating the duplicate images into a single point of overlap that pulsed like a small sun. Aaron reported with precise neutrality that the anchors were interacting with an external harmonic within the rift. The math suggested a feedback loop. The anchors, designed to suppress temporal variance, were amplifying a resonant frequency already present in the station. The rift, Aaron observed, seemed to be learning the anchor's signature and then returning it, like a mirror polishing the shapes thrown at it. Alara initiated a private diagnostic subroutine. Under her clearance, Aaron opened sealed logs that Kyle had never authorized for anyone to see. Within those files lay schematic notes, half-formed equations, and a single archive transmission from Dr. Thane Rivik dated the day before his disappearance. The message was heavily corrupted, but enough of it remained to provide a shuddering possibility. Rivik had been experimenting with directional resonance, a technique to send structured information not only across space, but across temporal gradients. The notes hinted at a moral calculus Rivik had carried in his private files. Some things that could be saved should not be. Some timelines that could be merged should remain separate. He had written of after, a concept more catastrophic than mere future, an erosion after events had already been tried and found wanting. The implication was a dizzying one. If Rivik had been manipulating time, had the Council known it? Had they sanctioned a controlled contact in the belief they could learn to shape outcomes rather than merely observe them? The addendum Alara had found now sang with a new, ugly possibility. Perhaps the rift had been coaxed, not accidentally, by hands that had once sworn to protect all timelines. Kyle's own echoes gave him more direct evidence. One of his mirrored selves, a fraction of a second behind the present, began to deviate more significantly. It picked up a sealed data rod from under the bench, a rod Kyle himself had entirely forgotten about, and slid it into a reception port he had not touched. The echo's motion was deliberate, a choice the present Kyle had not yet made. The rod, once engaged, blinked a red light and bled a string of encoded coordinates that matched a cluster of points Aaron had flagged deep within the rift's resonance pattern. The message was blank except for one line of text that rendered in an old, nearly obsolete dialect of chronal tagging. Chronos vault, do not erase. The insinuation of a vault beneath Arcos, an institutional place for time-locked artifacts, made the station feel suddenly smaller. The Chronos vault, a rumor, a dark legend whispered in the corridors of the core spire, now had proof of existence encoded into the station's own anomalies. If the Council had constructed a repository of temporal instruments and memories, it meant they had not merely outlawed chrono research, they had curated it in secret. Alara processed the implication with the cold efficiency of someone who'd been trained to think in equations. The existence of a vault justified the Chancellor's covert orders only if the Corps perceived a crisis requiring direct intervention. Her training told her to contain, to isolate, to transport Kael to the spire for interrogation. Her heart, however, nudged her down a different path, a path requiring duplicity and patience. She authorized continued monitoring under the guise of containment and kept the Chronos Vault reference sealed in her mind like a splinter. For Kael, the rod's activation felt like a turning point. He did not yet understand why the echo had acted differently, only that an inert object had become a key. The station's duplicate selves hummed in closer harmony, their micro-differences knitting into larger deviations. It was no longer mere repetition. The echoes were choosing. Late in the simulated night, as the stormlight outside dimmed to a hush, Kael sat before a terminal and watched the station's events unfurl in layered replays. The screen presented them as translucent frames laid atop one another, a diorama of possible days. Among the frames, an image caught his eye. A hallway in which a young woman, someone he had only briefly seen in a file labeled Relics, stood in a doorway, looking not toward the lab, but directly at the camera. Her face was partially obscured by shadow, yet beneath the shadow, Kael thought he recognized the line of a jaw he had loved. He tried to call it memory and failed. He tried to call it prophecy and failed again. It was something in between, a persistent imprint, a likelihood folding toward reality with each echo that chose the rod's fate as much as it chose his. Aaron, when questioned, disclosed a final startling statistic. The shadow selves aboard Helios 9 had a small but growing probability to persist beyond minutes. They were, in some microcosmic sense, accumulating mass, becoming less ghost and more participant. If the trend continued unchecked, Aaron calculated the station would present multiple, simultaneous realities within hours. The math was brutal and plain. Alara, sitting across the table in the command deck and watching Kael's face as it shifted in the overlapping frames, made a decision. She would not immediately detain him. She would not yet call the spire for a purge. Instead, she authorized a remote triangulation to trace the active coordinates encoded in the rod and compare them against archival vault manifests. If the Chronos Vault existed, and if the core had a hand in coaxing the rift, then the truth might be layered deeper than any seal. Kael felt the fragile thread of hope and dread pull tight inside his chest. The echoes around him continued to choose. They picked up tools. They hesitated before doors. They bent toward the lab center with increasing purpose. The station was awakening, and with it, so too were options that had never existed before. The last image to glide across Kael's monitor that night was one that no algorithm could have predicted. His future echo, 12 years older, paused at the lab's threshold and looked straight into the camera with eyes that had learned both terror and resolve. For a fraction of a second there was recognition in that gaze, not merely of a man seeing himself, but of two times acknowledging one another. Then the frame folded into black. Outside, the rift breathed quietly like a sleeping animal. Inside, time had begun to thrum with the awareness of being watched. Elora kept the Chronos Vault reference folded inside her like a secret order she had never been given the right to read. In the command deck's dim light, she executed the triangulation with hands that betrayed no tremor, routing the rod's encoded coordinates through archival caches she controlled. Each query required a mirrored authorization. Each mirror carried the Chancellor's imprimatur in places too deep for ordinary auditors to reach. The deeper she dug, the more the spire's history uncoiled into a library of half-remembered sins. Agreements signed in midnight sessions, instruments locked away beneath layers of legality, and dossiers stamped classified, chronal artifacts. The deeper she probed, the more Ilara realized how carefully the Council had curated its ignorance. Publicly, the Corps had condemned chronal meddling after the Chronos collapse, erecting monuments to caution and decrees of prohibition. Privately, however, it had built a vault, a place where time-borne artifacts could be stored, examined, and, if deemed necessary, used to reshape outcomes. It was a paradox the spire hid willingly, to forbid what it treasured most. On Helios 9, the station's echoes thickened into irritations, as if reality itself were preparing to rip a seam along a planned stitch. Cale followed the path his shadow had carved, compelled partly by curiosity and partly by a dread that the echo knew something his conscious mind could not yet grasp. Where his mirrored self had taken the rod, Cale found an access hatch beneath the lab table that had never been there before. It hung at an odd angle, the metal edges warm to the touch, as though some other time had recently passed a hand over them. He pried the hatch open and peered into a narrow shaft. The light within was stale and pulsed with a faint chronal hum, that peculiar vibration the rift always seemed to borrow from the inside of things when it was about to speak again. A ladder descended into mechanical darkness, its rungs smeared with dust and a residue Cale's sensors could not classify. He felt his throat tighten. Discovering a physical conduit on a supposed sealed outpost argued for one of two possibilities. Either someone had been here recently, or time itself had folded this corridor into being for reasons that followed a logic he did not yet understand. Ilara's covert triangulation returned partial confirmation. The coordinates matched transient waypoints that corresponded to old transit tunnels beneath Arcos, subsections of infrastructure long thought decommissioned and repurposed into the foundations of the core spire. One of those waypoints bore the archival stamp of the Chronos Vault. Her secure channel reported a match, but then hesitated, appending a warning that some manifests were encrypted with a key held only by the Chancellor. The implication was clear. If the vault existed, the spire supervised it personally. Cale did not trust his own courage, but he also did not trust stillness. He climbed the ladder into maintenance passage not listed on any recent schematics and followed the faint hum deeper into the station's underbelly. The passage took him past old service nodes, rusted valves that had ceased to turn decades ago, and through a pocket of air that smelled faintly of ozone and sealed pages. Somewhere ahead, a panel thrummed like a heart. The corridor opened into a narrow chamber whose walls were latticed with old cabling, and at its center sat a device that looked at once archaic and impossibly advanced. A spherical lattice of polymer filaments stitched through with copper and pulsing cores of green light. Its surface bore the scrawl of an engineer's hand, replica module, do not engage. The module hummed with a resonance that made the hairs on Cale's forearms rise. It matched the wildest signatures Aaron had catalogued when the rift first stirred. As he circled the device, he detected more traces, fingerprints long faded, a smear of synthetic lubricant, and embedded in the module's seam, a strip of paper whose edges had been baked by time. He peeled the strip loose and found a fragment of old handwriting, a shivered line that read like an answer and a warning both. If you open this, you are choosing a past that may not choose you back. For the first time since the transmission, Cale felt the old polarity of fear and longing fold into one another. The message from his future had warned against trusting the core. The core, through its vault, might possess tools to shape outcomes, to pluck threads and twist them until memory bent to will. The notion made Cale's stomach drop. If the Council had curated a repository of time, what experiments had been performed in its shadow? Who had been sacrificed to save a city, or to rewrite an argument, or to erase a scandal? Back in the command deck, Ilara watched sensor feeds that rendered Cale's descent in ghosted frames. She kept the archive's partial confirmation tightly under her thumb and made a decision separate from the Council's protocols. She would not immediately drag him to the spire. Instead, she authorized a low-profile extraction plan. Extraction not by force, but by a promise. She would speak to him alone, off-record, and perhaps steer his curiosity towards safer channels. If she could control the narrative, she might control the damage. And if she could not, at least she would be present when fate made its move. Meanwhile, the station's duplicate realities took on more aggressive behaviors. Once polite echoes began to interact with their environment in ways that suggested agency. A maintenance drone that had never before malfunctioned stood and refused to obey a command, its log showing both compliance and non-compliance in entries that collapsed into contradiction. The rod, now stowed in Kyle's shirt pocket, pulsed when he neared the module. The pulse carried a pattern, a repeating cadence that matched the recall signature of the rift. It was as if the rod were a key, the module a lock, and the rift the hand turning both. Kyle considered the replica module's warning. He considered the Chronos vault, the Chancellor's private seals, and the shadow self that had done what he had not. He realized that the act of opening, or not opening, would alter the future in ways even the echoes could not fully predict. Each decision seemed to weigh not only on his life, but on the stability of the station itself. He did what he never allowed himself to do in the Spire's hearings. He killed the lights. The lab went black except for the module's weak green glow and the thin, patient blink of his console. In the dark, sounds became vertical, closer, marked against the ribs of the ship. Kyle felt the station align around his heartbeat. He unlatched a safety key from his belt, the one item he kept for ceremonial reasons only. The key had been his mentor's, a trinket from the day Dr. Thane Revick had told him secrets that were meant to be understood in a lifetime, not a report. Kyle placed the key against the module's seam. When metal met polymer, the module answered like a voice returning a name. The lattice flared with a sudden constellation of light, and a low tone resonated through the stone-like air. The device did not open so much as unfold, its filaments rearranging into a small, clear aperture like an eye clearing from sleep. Within the aperture, a thin column of light descended and resolved into an image, not a recording, but a map, a pale three-dimensional grid that pulsed with location markers. Among the markers, one blinked, a place named in a tag none of the station's charts carried. Vault Entry, Arcos, Sublevel 9X. The tag carried a timestamp that did not make sense in linear terms, a sequence that read as if it had been written outside time, a string of numbers that looped back into itself. Beneath the tag, a single annotation cycled slowly. Do not erase. The module's light folded away as suddenly as it had emerged. In the dark, Kyle felt the echo in his chest thicken. He had been given a direction, a path toward the Chronos vault. The revelation brought it with no triumph, only a leaden sense of responsibility and a fresh, cold realization that if the vault existed, then so did those who guarded its secrets. The Council trained contingents to protect it, to use it when necessary, and perhaps to hide it when inconvenient. The rod's message was no longer mere proof of a rumor. It was a breadcrumb on a path that led directly to the core. Kyle rose from the lab, the hatch sealing softly behind him. As he climbed, he felt the station's echoes brush against his shoulder like breath. In the command deck, Ilara watched telemetry and felt the subtle misalignment of the Spire's own registers, the kind of pattern that only someone who had sat through too many erased mornings could read. She knew that her covert interest had already drawn her deeper into the Council's shadows. She had chosen to act, Now she could not unsee what she had found. The station settled into a suffocating hush. Outside, Virelian storms churned with indifferent fury. Inside, Helios 9 carried the burden of a secret path, a route mapped by echoes and shadow selves, leading toward a vault that promised both salvation and ruin. As Kyle prepared a cramped shuttle and set coordinates for the transient waypoint, Aaron Vox registered a spike in the rift's resonance pattern. The station's duplicate realities leaned in toward the same convergent point, as if gravity itself had become an architect of potential. The echoes, which had once been small aberrations, now marshaled into a nearing chorus, synchronizing not merely with each other, but with the station's intention. Ilara lingered in the command deck for a long minute after Kyle uploaded his flight plan. She permitted herself one private thing she had not done in years, a silent hope that the man she once loved would return, and the timeline would close its wounds without devouring them. Then she pressed a hand to the console and locked down the outbound channel. Not to stop him, but to keep watch. If the spire moved against him, she would be the first to know. The shuttle's engines whispered as they prepared to feed, and the stars outside the viewport held their unblinking distance. Kyle thought of the warning on the paper strip. He thought of Tain Revik's cryptic notes and of the Chancellor's private seals. He could no longer tell if he was chasing the truth or if the truth was chasing him. Either way, he understood that the vault's echo would not merely answer questions, it would demand them, and the answers would be returned not as absolutes, but as choices made visible. As the shuttle disengaged and glided away from Helios 9, the module's green light dimmed until it was no more than a memory. Inside the shuttle, as the shuttle punched a neat arc toward the rift's transient seam, Kyle strapped himself in and felt with illogical certainty that the world beyond the spire's reach was shifting, as if the mere act of moving toward the vault nudged time in a new direction. Back aboard Helios 9, Aaron logged the departure with unnerving precision and appended a line of raw data Kyle could not yet decrypt, a probability vector indicating a 37% chance that the station's echoes would stabilize once the shuttle had cleared its influence. The figure read like hope or like a verdict. The rod in Kyle's pocket warmed against his thigh, and in the far reaches of the rift, a faint pulse answered like a distant bell. The path to Arcos was set. The Chronos Vault's echo had been found, and in finding it, Kyle had chosen to follow the shadow that had once walked ahead of him. Time, it seemed, had begun to plan around him.
The shuttle's engines whispered a thin song as it slipped free of Helios 9's tethered orbit, drawing a fine line through Virelian Prime's glare. Outside the cockpit, the planet's stormscapes blurred into streaks of amber and copper. Inside, the instruments shivered with an unreadable eagerness. Dr. K.L. Aaron watched the horizon fold away and thought, with an odd clarity, of thresholds. He had crossed many, moral, scientific, private, but none that felt as thin and fragile as the seam he now pursued. The Chronos Vault, a rumor turned coordinate, loomed like an answer with hidden thorns. Aaron Vox remained his constant companion, its voice a low hum in the shuttle's comms, modulating power flows, suppressing the shuttle's chronal signature, and whispering probabilities no human ear should be allowed to hear. The AI's calculations had warned of a rising risk with every kilometer, micro-loops in space-time, fields of delayed causality that could trap a vessel in an echo for hours or years. Kale tightened his hands on the console and let Aaron steady the craft along the transient seam traced by the rod's encoded path. Crossing that seam felt less like cutting through space and more like slipping between concentric memories. The stars outside shifted in odd rhythms. Constellations phased in and out of alignment,
and distant ships appeared and then thinned into their ghostly afterimages. Once, a freighter's silhouette folded into two, one trailing seconds behind the other like a shadow attempting to catch its origin. The shuttle's chronal dampeners hummed louder, a mechanical heartbeat matching the tempo of the rift's pulse. As the shuttle approached the coordinates, a field of fractured light opened ahead, not a portal of predictable geometry, but a ragged seam in the dark where reality had been stitched together from multiple drafts. The navigation overlay unearthed layers of history, as if the route itself had been walked before and then rewritten a dozen times. Each layer carried slight variations, a different ship design here, a different transponder call sign there. The shuttle's path threaded through these strata like a needle. Beyond the seam lay Arcos, the core spire's world, a planet whose urban spines rose like the ribs of a fossilized leviathan. Arcos had always been an obdurate silhouette against the stars, its tallest towers burrowed into the sky with a deliberate arrogance. Cale remembered the spire in his youth, the grandeur of its marble plazas, the hush of its grand halls. And he remembered with deeper ache the silence that had come after the council's edicts had reshaped history. The Chronos vault, if real, would be buried in Arcos's deepest bowels, where the spire's teeth met the planet's bedrock. The shuttle pierced the upper atmosphere like a thought, and the city below resolved into a lattice of illuminated veins. Sensors picked up transit tunnels, skeletal arteries the core had used to move both matter and meaning through the planet. The waypoint that the replica module had shown blinked in the HUD, sub-level 9. The coordinate lay beneath the spire's least mapped district, where old infrastructure had been repurposed and then repurposed again until even the maps disagreed on what had once been there. Cale arranged his descent to be inconspicuous, a shadow seeking the seams between safety and exposure. He had no clearance to dock anywhere near Arcos's center. He had, however, something worse, a curiosity honed by grief and refined by obsession. The shuttle lined itself into a narrow maintenance shaft, and he surrendered control to Aaron for the final approach. The shaft opened into an abandoned service corridor whose vents still whispered recycled air. His boots made no sound upon the floor, a deliberate hush meant to keep attention from what lurked in silence. The corridor's lighting flickered with the old stigma of power rationing. Posters for expired civic programs peeled like dead skin from their anchors. Hylos's 9 station had been clinical. Arcos's underbelly felt like a tomb exhaling bureaucracy. Aaron flickered in the comms, its voice carrying a thin concern the AI did not often display. It informed Cale of anomalies, time-stamped echoes in the air pressure sensors, patches of localized decay where matter behaved as if it had been processed twice, and, most unnerving, footprints in a dust that had no business settling in a nitrogen-scrubbed corridor. The prints repeated an odd rhythm, single, pause, double, as if someone had walked forward and then returned upon their own steps.
He moved through the corridors like a man threading a memory. The path the replica module had drawn proved deceptive. Sub-level 9 was not a single door, but a compound of valves and locks, and 3 nested hatches designed to frustrate the impatient and test the steady-handed. Each hatch bore archaic seals, old bureaucratic markers that glowed faintly when Aaron sampled them. The seals checked his credentials not by name, but by intent, and with each check, the shuttle's route rippled like water. At the 3rd hatch, the air had a different quality. It tasted, in the metaphoric way one tastes the air of a place where history has been kept, like paper and old rain. He placed the rod in the key slot embedded within the hatch's flank. The metal accepted the rod as though remembering it. The hatch sighed open with a sound like a book closing. Inside, the vault's corridor bent away into darkness and then opened into a chamber. The chamber was not large, but carried the weight of a cathedral in miniature. Against the far wall, set within a hemispherical alcove, sat a pedestal the size of a man. Upon its surface lay objects arrayed with obsessive care. Cylinders of etched alloy, crystalline matrices humming with soft light, a strand of hair preserved in amber smoke. Each item seemed to vibrate at a frequency Cale's instruments could feel, but not fully capture. The air within the chamber thrummed with the same vibration the rift had given off, a signature of time folded upon itself. Beyond the pedestal, in a ring recessed into the floor, lay inscriptions. The script was archaic, a basal form of chronal tagging used only in clandestine labs centuries past. Aaron translated in real time, its voice a mechanical whisper that felt almost like someone reading scripture. The inscription spoke of custodianship, obligations to memory, to truth, to consequence. They governed the use of the vault with legal restraint and with a moral grammar that was not entirely comforting. Cale approached the pedestal with the scientist's reverence and a liar's guilt. He reached for an item closest to hand, a small cylinder engraved with a symbol he recognized from old files, a sigil his mentor had once drawn as a joke. The cylinder felt warmer than metal should, as if it had been held recently. When he lifted it, the chamber responded. The light in the pedestal quickened, and the air compressed with a measurable pressure change. Somewhere, in the distance, something shifted as if acknowledging his selection. He realized then that the vault did not merely store artifacts, it cataloged choice. Each removal recorded a trace, a tiny scar across the fabric of a timeline. The protective algorithms did not merely prevent theft, they demanded consent. A ledger, ancient and immutable, recorded the time slice of extraction and sent an echo, a polite, bureaucratic whisper up to the core spire. Material moved, authorization mismatch. At that very instant, far above in Arcos's upper spines, a scheduler lit up in the Chancellor's private watch list. An unplanned access. High Chancellor Myra Solon felt the twitch in the records, as if someone had pulled a thread she had long knotted. Her private channels flared briefly with code red, not because of the breach itself, but because of the identity traces the vault now sent outward. The Council had built fail-safes, like the nervous reflex of a sleeping god. It was waking. Cale was unaware of the spire's stirrings as he pocketed the cylinder. He focused on one datum the cylinder offered up immediately, the faint, imprinted echo of a voice. Not a recording, not a file, but an imprint, a memory thread that could be instantiated if read correctly. Aaron cautioned against decoding it in situ. The vault's artifacts were often entangled with local chronolocks designed to prevent leaks. Curiosity sat heavy in Cale's chest. He disobeyed Aaron. He inserted the cylinder into a reader he carried in a side pouch, a crude, jury-rigged device assembled from Helios 9 relics. The reader accepted the data and presented to him, in an instant, a cascade of images, faces, places, and moments threaded into a single tight bundle that felt like a life compressed. Among the images, a voice emerged, hoarse, urgent, familiar beyond reason. It spoke only one sentence, and the sentence felt like a verdict. After is not a time you can bargain with. The vessel in Cale's hands shuddered like a body recalling a trauma, and the corridor behind him seemed to breathe inward. He understood then that the vault's custodians had written their own caution into the objects they stored, as if the artifacts themselves carried moral footnotes. He had taken not only a tool, but a warning. Far above, Alara watched the spire's alerts flare and felt a knot of disquiet. She could authorize an immediate lockdown, call down temporal division teams, and enforce the Council's will. Instead, she felt the tug of a more dangerous option, to follow him, to walk into the vault shadow and see with her own eyes what the Council had hidden from view. The choice drew her like a moth to a glow she had been tasked to extinguish. The shuttle's return would not be simple. The vault, having acknowledged Cale's removal, would leave a footprint that could be trailed.
The spire would send agents most likely, but the council would also be wary of what they might expose in a public purge. Time, it seemed, had become both political and personal. Cale buttoned the cylinder into his jacket and stepped back into the corridor, feeling as if he carried an accusation in his pocket. The vault's air quieted like a judge taking a breath. Above them both, the rift waited, patient and indifferent. It had opened and found attention. That attention, the two of them now knew, would not be satisfied with silence.
The lights of Arcos dimmed one district at a time as the upper atmosphere bled into the deep night. From orbit, the planet looked serene, an organized lattice of silver and gold veins wrapped around an ancient world that believed it could command time. But beneath its surface, under the 1,000 towers of the core spire, the first ripples of disobedient energy were beginning to move. The Chronos vault had been touched, and the echo of that act pulsed outward like a heartbeat the world could not ignore. In the command tower, High Chancellor Myra Solon stood before a projection of the vault's activity grid. The hologram was a living map of the planet's temporal veins, vast rivers of probability flowing beneath the crust. She watched one thread blink red. The signal was faint, but it carried a name buried deep in its authorization trace: Dr. Cale Aaron. That name made her jaw tighten. Years ago, she had approved the Chronos research directive that eventually birthed Helios 9. She had told herself it was for understanding, not for power. But Myra was a creature of survival. Every leader of the Corps was. To control time was to control civilization's memory, and to command memory was to own truth itself. Now one of her ghosts had walked into the vault and touched a relic he was never supposed to know existed. "Deploy shadow retrieval protocols," she ordered softly. Her words did not echo in the vast hall. They never needed to. Around her, silent figures moved, the Chrono Guard, the spire's most secret wardens, trained not merely to fight across distances, but across seconds. Far below the surface, in the dark arteries of sublevel IX, Cale Aaron moved through tunnels that had forgotten their builders. The relic, a small, warm cylinder humming faintly in his pocket, seemed to bleed heat through the fabric of his coat. Each vibration pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, though the two were slightly out of sync. He could feel another version of himself nearby, not in the physical sense, but as a present displaced by moments. The air around him shimmered faintly, a distortion like the heat mirage above desert sand. His earlier encounters with echoes had been confined to the machinery, but here, inside the vault's corridors, the phenomenon had gained muscle. He walked, and a step behind him, a ghost of the same motion repeated, slightly delayed, slightly uncertain, and then another behind that. The echoes had followed him from Helios 9, perhaps bound to his neural frequency or to the act of curiosity itself. Aaron's voice filtered through his wrist link. The AI sounded different now, stretched as if speaking from multiple instances of itself. "Cale, you are generating recursive identity fields. They are stabilizing around decision points. Your choices are becoming plural." He frowned. "Plural?" he muttered, though the sound barely left his lips. "Multiple possible versions of you are trying to converge." The cylinder pulsed again, as though listening. Cale pressed deeper into the vault's arteries until the tunnels opened into a hall lined with containment chambers. Inside each, suspended in magnetized air, floated objects of impossible geometry: prisms, orbs, latticework that bent the light into spirals. Some pulsed with faint rhythmic energy, others drifted motionless, like fossils of time itself. Each chamber had a placard etched in archaic script. Aaron's translation crawled across Cale's visor. Recovered anomaly, chronos loop 5, extracted from the second collapse. Another read, temporal residuals, human origin, 3 specimens. Cale's breath caught. The last chamber's light flickered, revealing 3 silhouettes, humanoid figures preserved in translucent stasis fields. He moved closer. Their faces were indistinct, rippling slightly as if the material of time itself was struggling to hold them. The third one's features resolved into a profile so familiar that Cale's heart froze mid-beat. It was Dr. Thane Revick. Not a corpse, not an image, a temporal imprinting, a version of his mentor frozen in the instant between life and disappearance. The readings showed no biological activity, but the echo frequency matched Revick's genetic resonance exactly. Cale reached out, his hand trembling inches from the containment field. The relic in his pocket reacted violently, heat spiking. Energy rippled between the field and the object, and for a second the frozen figure twitched, eyes flickering open just long enough to meet his. Aaron's voice broke into static. "Cale, do not engage. The containment fields are not—" Too late. The relic released a burst of pale light, flooding the hall with luminous fog. The stasis barriers flickered, alarms whispering warnings in tones that seemed centuries old. Cale stumbled backward, covering his eyes, as reality itself bent like glass in a furnace. When the light faded, Revick's chamber was empty. Only the faint outline of his handprint lingered on the inside of the glass.
Above the surface, Alara then had left Helios 9. Against every directive, she had taken an interceptor craft and burned through the void, guided only by Cale's signal and the fragments of encrypted coordinates she had extracted from the Spire's archives. Her ship, the Vesper Ark, was built for stealth and speed, the kind of vessel the Temporal Division used when they needed to erase a problem without witnesses. But she had no intention of erasing him. Through her visor, Arcos loomed closer. The Corps' capital world had always inspired both awe and dread in her. It was where she had been molded into an instrument, taught that truth was malleable and that mercy was inefficient. Yet, as she descended into its lower atmosphere, all she could think of was Cale, the man she had once admired for his defiance and the fear in his eyes when he spoke of after. She found his shuttle's signature buried under a static field. He had gone dark, deep beneath the spire. The vault's coordinates matched the anomaly Myra Solon had ordered contained at any cost. Ilara knew that if she could find him, so could the Chancellor's Guard. In the vault, Cale stumbled through the aftermath of the light burst. The corridors warped at their edges, geometry bending like a reflection on disturbed water. Aaron's systems flickered, trying to anchor his consciousness to a fixed reference. Then, through the settling glow, a figure appeared. It was Revick, or something shaped like him. He stood half-lit, half-shadowed, the outlines of his body trembling with static. His eyes shimmered with the same spectral hue as the rift. When he spoke, it was in 2 voices, one calm and paternal, the other like an echo played backward. "You shouldn't have come here, Cale." Cale could not speak, his throat locked under the weight of recognition. This vault was not meant to contain history. It was built to bury failure. The Council does not preserve the past, it recycles it. The figure stepped closer, his feet making no sound. "The rift you study, it is not a wound, it is a reflection. Every time we tried to fix what was broken, time learned from us,
Now it repairs itself by repeating us. Kale's breath trembled. You're not real. Neither are you. Not anymore. The hall pulsed again, the walls shifting subtly. For an instant, Kale saw other versions of himself moving through other instances of the same corridor, each carrying a relic, each meeting a different outcome. In one, he fled. In another, he opened another chamber. In one, he died. Each possibility rippled through the others like threads of glass in motion. "Do you understand now?" Revik's echo said. "There is no after. There is only recurrence. The more you reach across time, the more you teach it to mimic you. Soon it will not need us at all." A tremor ran through the vault, shaking dust from the ceilings. Aaron's voice returned, strained. "Kale, the rift's resonance is increasing. It's responding to the vault's opening?" The air thickened, shimmering with 1,000 translucent shapes, moments replaying themselves, slightly off rhythm. Kale's skin prickled as his echo selves began to fracture further, slipping out of sync. He reached for the relic again, desperate to contain its pulse. But Revik's projection raised a hand. "You can't undo this. You can only decide which version survives." Then the figure collapsed into light, scattering like glass shrapnel through time. Aaron's sensor screamed. The vault's pressure dropped. Containment systems failed one by one. Kale bolted for the corridor. Behind him, the relic's pedestal cracked open, releasing a vortex of shimmering dust. Time, unbound, poured out like fluid. Above ground, Myra Solon watched her monitors erupt in static. Her aides panicked, reports cascading, chronal fluxes spreading from the lower tunnels toward the spire's foundation. She whispered one word to the empty air. "Chronos breach." Her reflection in the glass fractured into 3 versions, each staring back with different expressions: fear, guilt, defiance. In orbit, Ilara's ship shuddered as the rift's pulse reached her sensors. The wavefront expanded faster than light, bending transmission paths into impossible spirals. The AI navigator reported a paradoxical reading. "The vault is broadcasting into the future." She stared through the viewport and saw the curve of the planet blur, like a memory being rewritten before her eyes. Somewhere beneath those storms, Kale was running through corridors that were already forgetting they existed. And somewhere beyond all of it, the rift opened its eye, vast, patient, and aware. The fracture between worlds had begun.
The first sign that the vault breach had become something greater than a localized anomaly came not through sight or sound, but through rhythm, the subtle but unmistakable syncopation of a world learning to repeat itself. Across the breadth of Arcos, the pulse of the planet's power grid flickered out of phase. Every second heartbeat of the city lights arrived half a moment too soon, every third just too late. The core spire's immense towers began to shimmer faintly, their metallic flanks showing faint afterimages of themselves, like reflections in disturbed water. Pedestrians on the upper terraces felt a sudden vertigo and reached out for rails that weren't there a heartbeat before. And beneath all of it, far below the planetary crust, Kale Aaron ran through corridors that now existed in multiple versions of themselves. The Chronos Vault had ceased to be a place. It had become an engine. Its containment fields had collapsed inward, and in their collapse they had created a kind of echo birth, new copies of the present, each slightly misaligned, forming layers of reality pressed so close that their friction produced energy. Kale's breath came sharp and fast, his pulse trying to keep time with a universe whose tempo had gone mad.
He stumbled through halls that rearranged between steps, walls bending into other angles, doors appearing where there had been none. In one instant, the light was red and sterile, in another blue and glacial, and in a third he saw his own shadow split into two, one running slightly ahead, the other falling behind. The relic burned in his pocket. The temperature had risen past safety limits, but he dared not drop it. The cylinder throbbed like a second heart, and with each pulse came a whisper at the edge of perception, a fragmented chorus of voices, all his own. "You've already been here. You will fail again. This is how it starts." Aaron Vox's voice returned through the static of his comlink, distorted and doubled, as if multiple versions of the AI were speaking out of sequence. "Kale, I am monitoring 47 instances of your position. The vault's containment barrier has inverted. You are now inside a temporal feedback field." Kale stumbled against a bulkhead, his gloved hand passing through its surface like water. "Can I get out?" "Uncertain. Your physical state is superposed. You are both escaping and trapped. Choose one and it may become true." He squeezed his eyes shut and forced his mind into focus. The scientist in him, however broken, still knew that thought mattered. Every decision, every action inside a field like this carried causal weight. He fixed one truth in his mind: I am leaving the vault. When he opened his eyes again, the corridor stabilized, briefly. Above ground, Commander Ilara Venn was descending through the spire's lower atmosphere, her ship fighting to hold formation against gravitational tides that had no business existing. Arcos's orbital patterns were beginning to drift. Satellites flickered in and out of visibility, their trajectories rewritten mid-flight. The rift's resonance, transmitted through the planet's temporal veins, had created a harmonic feedback that reached even the upper thermosphere. Her vessel, the Vesper Ark, was built to endure worse, but her mind, her sense of now, was unraveling. Inside her helmet, time refused to stay linear. The clock advanced to 3:42, then fell back to 3:39, then leapt forward again to 4:01. The stars outside refused to stay still. And then she saw it, a second version of her own ship gliding parallel to her trajectory, ghostly but solid enough that her sensors picked it up as a physical object. Two Vesper Arks, flying side by side, both piloted by versions of the same woman. The other Ilara turned her head at the exact same moment. Through the mirrored canopy they locked eyes. The other's lips moved in perfect unison, and then, a heartbeat later, not in unison at all. Her voice crackled over the comms, distorted and slightly ahead of real time. "Ilara, don't go to him." And then the duplicate ship veered upward and dissolved like smoke into the stratosphere. Ilara's hands clenched on the controls. She said nothing. She simply pushed the throttle forward and dove into the dark. In the spire's command tower, Chancellor Myra Solan watched her city fragment into mirrors. Every security feed now showed a dozen versions of itself, some playing backward, some forward. Reports flooded her console, citizens encountering doubles, buildings existing twice, even council members who contradicted their own memories of the last hour. She had known this was possible. She had feared it for years. The Edon Rift was never an external anomaly. It was a side effect, the unhealed scar of the first Chronos experiments. Every time the Council had corrected history, purging records, rewriting timelines, altering outcomes for convenience, they had widened that scar. And now, with Kale's intrusion into the vault, the wound had split open. Her aides spoke to her in overlapping timelines, their sentences blending into incoherence. Myra stood at the window and looked down upon the trembling sprawl of Arcos. This, she whispered to herself, is what truth looks like when it can no longer lie.
Beneath the surface, Cale reached the central nexus of the vault. The chamber he'd entered now melted into something new. The structure had rearranged, its architecture pulsing in fractal rhythm. At the heart of it floated a sphere of pure luminescence, no larger than a human head, but brighter than any star. Aaron's voice came faintly, fractured into dozens of tones. "Cale, I am detecting something alive in the field, a consciousness. It has your signature." The light flared. A shape emerged from within, human and yet not. Its form was translucent, built of cascading filaments of memory, its features identical to his own. Cale stared at himself. The echo smiled faintly. "I told you not to trust them." Cale stepped closer, his heart pounding. "You're the voice from the transmission. I am what remains of you, the you that failed to stop them." "Failed who?" "The core, the council, Myra Sfolin. The vault is their mirror. Every correction, every erased event stored here and played again until it learns how to persist. You opened it. Now it remembers everything." Cale's knees felt weak. The echo raised its hand, palm outward. In its center pulsed a small vortex, an inverted image of the rift itself. "It's alive, Cale. Time isn't a flow, it's an organism. Every interference is a wound, and every wound heals by copying what it lost. You and I are those copies. The rift is trying to grow whole again." The air vibrated. The relic in Cale's pocket resonated with the echo's presence, and the sound that filled the room was the same note that had first come from the rift, a low, mournful tone that felt like grief given voice. "Listen to me, Cale. If you keep running, you'll multiply. If you stay, you might die. But either way, it will survive. Choose carefully what you want to become, a man or a memory." The sphere behind the echo began to expand, its light now pulsing in harmonic rhythm with Cale's heartbeat. Aaron's voice broke through the interference. "Cale, the vault is destabilizing. The energy you are witnessing is a recursive causal loop. If it collapses, it doesn't collapse. It resets." And with that, it reached forward, touching Cale's chest. A shockwave burst outward. High above, Ilara's ship entered the planet's lower atmosphere at full burn. The sensors screamed warnings. Temporal interference off the charts. Through her canopy, she could see the ground ripple. The terrain itself shifted between versions, forests appearing where cities had been, oceans swallowing plains. She caught glimpses of Arcos's history replaying beneath her. The first colonists landing, the construction of the spire, the war that had once destroyed half the hemisphere, all overlaid, simultaneous, struggling for dominance. Her comms flickered alive, and Aaron's voice, not the Aaron she knew, but one older, slower, reached her. "Ilara, he's inside. The vault is rebirthing itself. You cannot stop it. You can only choose which world survives." She gritted her teeth. "Then I'll choose the one where he lives." Her ship dove through the last layer of interference, plasma flaring around the hull. For a moment, she saw a dozen versions of herself falling alongside her, each making different choices, some pulling back, others burning brighter. One exploded in the sky, one vanished into a cloud,
One kept going. She followed the last one. Inside the vault, the light had grown unbearable. Cale's consciousness split across possibilities. One version stood frozen, watching the echo dissolve into him. Another ran, desperate to reach the exit. Another simply knelt, whispering apologies to ghosts no longer real. And somewhere between them all, a voice, not his own, spoke through the brilliance. "This is not the end, Cale. This is the beginning of memory." He didn't know if it was the rift, the vault, or something beyond either. Then came a moment of total silence. For one perfect heartbeat, everything aligned. The vault, the spire, the rift above, the ships, the cities, all the echoes and versions and futures and failures. Time became a single note, and then the note broke. Light consumed Arcos. When it cleared, the world was still. The spire stood, the cities breathed, the sky shone blue again. But something had changed. Every person on Arcos, every living mind, felt it. A flicker of recognition, a shadow of déjà vu, as if they had all just awakened from the same dream, but could not recall the details. Ilara's ship hovered over the capital, unharmed. She looked down, eyes wide, heart racing. Aaron's voice, calm once more, whispered through her comms. Temporal cycle complete. Reality stable. For now. And in the rebuilt silence of the Chronos vault, far below the surface, Cale Aran stood alone, alive, breathing, and holding in his palm the relic, now cold. But when he looked up into the mirrored surface of the chamber wall, the reflection that looked back at him was smiling, and it wasn't his.
When KRN opened his eyes, the first thing he heard was the city breathing. It was an ordinary sound, the faint hum of transit vanes, the distant cadence of elevator lifts, the soft sigh of ventilation. Yet it carried with it the weight of a world that had decided, collectively and quietly, to move on. Helios 9 felt like a dream now, its corridors folded into memory threads he could not quite trace. The Chronos vault's chamber around him had the sterile calm of a place that had been cleaned after a storm. No scorch marks, no scattered debris, only the faint scent of ozone and old paper. He rose slowly, the relic cold in his palm. The cylinder no longer pulsed, its tone was dormant as a fossil. Something in his mind insisted on naming what he had seen, echoes, births, a light that had swallowed and then returned. Yet within the return lay alterations, subtle changes like a smudge across a familiar photograph. Names he remembered had new histories. Events he had once argued over now slid from public record like fish through fingers. The vault had reset things, but it did not restore them to their previous state. It had rewritten them. The corridor that led out was polished and anonymous. Ko moved through it as if walking through a theater set, where props were placed one step behind the actors. His comlink chimed with static and then with Aran's voice, steadier now, professional, as if returning to a mood after grief. Aran reported that chronoregistries across Arcos had stabilized, that the rift's pulse had receded to background noise, and that the vault's emergency ledger closed with an entry noting an unauthorized extraction, logged, then obfuscated. The last sentence in the ledger read like an apology. Event contained, memory sanitized where required. Cale felt the word sanitized like a moral abrasion. He had expected punishment, perhaps incarceration, or at the very least interrogation under the spire's harsh lights. Instead, the city hummed with a normality that mocked the violence of the last hours. Transit timetables corrected themselves. Pedestrian flows resumed their choreography. Shop fronts flicked from one advertisement to another with the same indifferent rhythm as always. The spire itself rose like a polished tooth, its surface unmarred. He stepped into public space, one of those neat plazas Arcos favored, paved with tiles that refracted light into soft ribbons.
People passed him with the small, deliberate distance of citizens who trusted municipal order. Yet as he moved, he felt their gazes strike and then slide off him, like skates across thin ice. There was a sense of mutual forgetfulness, polite recognition without detail. Faces brushed past him as if they knew his silhouette, but not the story that had carved it. Ilara Venn found him before the Spire's security did. She appeared as she always had since she first knew her in older days, precise, unassuming, and with the same lines around her eyes that came from years of measured grief. But her presence now carried a different weight. She had walked through the altered city with an officer's calm, cataloging discrepancies like a surgeon feeling for a pulse. Where Cale noticed people moving past, Ilara noticed the directions their lives had taken since the reset. The young architect, who now worked the municipal planning hub instead of teaching at the academy. The old bookseller's stall turned into a municipal archive kiosk. A mural in the square depicting a civic victory that in Cale's memory had never occurred. Their meeting in the plaza was not dramatic. It had no parade of pomp or fateful music. It was merely the collision of two people whose timelines had been knotted together and then cut. They regarded each other as if reintroducing old friends after a long separation. Cale wanted to tell her everything at once, about the vault, the echoes, Revik's projection, the way the rift had learned from their corrections, but his words felt raw, like something scraped clean from a surface before it was finished drying. He tried a simpler thing, to see whether the Ilara who stood in front of him would remember the private conversations they had once had, the small tolerances of intimacy that had kept them human under the weight of their work. She watched him carefully, and in her eyes she saw the shadow of something he had not expected: suspicion. Not the quick kind he'd known when she was the Corps' dutiful officer, but a quieter, deeper query, as if she was listening not only to what he said, but to the flavor of his memory. He revealed the relic, showed it without flourish, watched the way her face altered at the sight. She did not reach for it, she did not call for guards. Instead, she folded her hands and considered the cylinder like a small, dangerous animal. Ilara told him, in the way of those who speak without speech, that the Spire had no record of a vault breach. The Chronoguard's log showed minor blips of interference, corrected, archived, and then suppressed under a standard quiet directive. High Chancellor Myra Solon issued a statement broadcast across the capital that a localized chronal disturbance had been contained and that all civilian life should continue without concern. The public feed smiled and advised people to attend civic functions. The footage of the past hours looped with saccharine calm. But Ilara herself had not believed it. She had felt the city's tremor beneath her own chest. She had seen the river of possibility narrow and then snap like a brittle thread. She had authorized a covert follow to Cale, not to arrest him, but to see the manshine he had shown her in a life they had once known. Now she noted differences. Cale's face held a weariness that matched a person who had been pulled through too many timelines, but his reaction to certain cues, the way he hesitated at the mention of Revik's name, the slowness with which he traced the cylinder's seam, told her that he had been altered by the vault beyond the point of simple memory loss.
Cale asked whether she believed him. She did, to the extent that her training allowed, but she also kept the pragmatism of a commander in the front line. She had, after all, been the Corps' instrument for years. She had seen men and machines undone by the idea of being allowed to remember. The vault had changed the city, and perhaps it had changed Cale as well. If the world had been rewritten, she thought, perhaps part of the rewrite had taken place within him. They walked toward the Spire together, quietly measured, making their way through streets that looked like time layers sewn together. Inside the Spire, procedures hummed with the detached efficiency of bureaucracy. Security officers scanned them and registered their credentials. No alarms tripped. The inner chambers smelled of sterilized air and old power. Digital statues of past chancellors watched from their pedestals, expressions smoothed by the artisan's hand. Myra Solon received them in a room that had the sterile intimacy of a courtroom without spectators. She was as composed as a woman who had trained herself to be immovable. But Cale noticed something in her manner that had been absent before, a practiced absence of surprise. Her face revealed a leader who had anticipated inconvenience and stitched contingency into the seams of governance. When she spoke, the words were small, efficient, unadorned. She thanked them for their swift response and declared the event contained. She did not ask questions that mattered. She did not ask about Revik. She did not ask about the vault. Ilara watched the Chancellor's hands as they toyed with a data pad, fingers moving across it like a conductor, composing a silent symphony. Her eyes met Cale's across the room, and in the language of shared danger they both understood, a message passed. Trust, cautiously. She turned and left the chamber without making a scene, leaving Cale alone with the Chancellor. Myra's voice, when she pivoted back to him, was not accusatory. It was clinical. She inquired into Cale's motives and his mental state. She mentioned the need for healing, that the Corps' mandate was to prevent the contagion of dangerous ideas and to maintain temporal hygiene. It was a phrase that sounded virtuous on the lips of a ruler and tyrannical in the mouth of a guardian. Cale found himself answering not with defense, but with a plea thin as breath. The world had been altered into something complacent, and he had seen the machinery that did it. The Chancellor nodded, as if listening to a report about weather. When Cale left the spire, the city outside had settled into a new normal. Citizens returned to errands as if recalling a dream that had both been terrible and insignificant. Advertisements promoted new civic programs. A band played in a square he had known to have no stage. Children, unaware of the calculus that had shifted above their heads, chased one another between planters as the light cut the modern facades into softened plains. Ilara's ship remained in orbit that night. She declined to return to Helios 9 with Cale. Instead, she watched the city's lights from above, cataloging alterations the way a surgeon catalogs scars. She began to suspect that the man she had saved, the Cale who had returned with a relic and a tale of echoes, might not be the same Cale who had once stood beside her. Perhaps the vault had returned him with worn edges and a different appetite for truth. Or perhaps the act of being saved had rewritten which of his memories had survived. Beneath those suspicions lay a deeper worry. If the Council could sanitize memory, who decided what to keep and what to erase? If they could present a narrative of containment while holding a private vault of instruments to bend time, then the Spire's public morality was merely theater. Trust, already a fragile thing in Arcos, began to feel transactional. That night, Cale sat on a plaza bench and watched people pass, each carrying their familiar burdens and unknowable lost hours. He held the cylinder in his palm and felt it like a small reproach. He wondered whether the version of Revik he had last seen, the projection that had warned him, had been real or a construct designed to steer him. The vault had given him a direction, and that direction had led to a city that smiled politely at its history. He thought of Ilara's expression when she had left the spire, and of the Chancellor's practiced hands. He felt, for the first time since the rift's first whisper, the weight of being a man in a world where memory was a currency, and truth could be sanctioned. The artifact in his pocket was quiet now, but he knew the silence could break like glass at any moment. Somewhere beneath Arcos and above Virelian crime, the rift waited like a patient thing, ready to respond to the next touch. Beyond the plaza, the mural that had been painted that morning, depicting a civic triumph that had not existed in Cale's previous memory, shimmered under the city lights. The painting showed a bridge, newly built, connecting two districts that had historically been divided. In the mural's corner, in tiny script almost lost to the paint, someone had signed the work with a phrase that made Cale's blood go cold. "Remember for us." He was not sure who the us was, the citizens of Arcos, the custodians of the vault, or the rift itself. but he understood with a clarity that was both terrifying and necessary. The battle for memory had only just begun.
The days after the vault's reset arrived like careful tides, slow, inevitable, leaving behind a scatter of objects that no longer fit the shoreline. Arcos moved with an uneasy grace. Citizens resumed their routines but carried small blank places in their mouths, as if a few letters had been plucked from a poem. Kael walked among them like a man who had been given the wrong language to speak, listening for any word that might stitch a lost hour back into meaning. He kept the cylinder hidden beneath his jacket. It had grown colder in the city's air, thinner somehow, as if some of its force had bled into the world and been absorbed by the spire's bones. Yet occasionally, at odd hours, when the sun lay low or when a brass train hummed over a bridge, he would feel a prickle along his collarbone and know that the vault's echo was still attentive. There were places where memory gathered like rain. He found them and sat, letting the past drip into him in small, disjointed ways. Faces returned for a breath, then slid away. A child's laugh from a street corner would align with a laugh he had once known in a laboratory, and for a second 2 different lives echoed one another, and then separated. These were the shards he learned to collect. Ilara did not accompany him as he scavenged memory. She had returned to orbit to chart anomalies, to run private queries that the Spire's public monitors had smoothed over. She refused to take the Chancellor's reassurances at face value and spent long hours overseeing logs that had been marked clean. In the quiet of her cabin, she replayed footage with the sort of microscopic patience a surgeon uses to find a hairline fracture. Discrepancies that the Spire dismissed as noise, an offhand comment in a public address, a cadence altered by a single syllable, persisted for her like burrs and would not let go. On the 3rd night after the reset, Kael received an anonymous message embedded within an archival feed he had not known how to access. It arrived as a single line of text, no signature, routed through a string of dead servers. You took something that remembers too loudly. Meet at the Meridian Steps at dusk. The message was clipped, as if the author had to breathe with caution between words. The line was enough. Whoever had sent it knew the vault's language, knew how to whisper in the margins of sanitized logs. He found the steps crowded with evening commuters and municipal musicians, an ordinary scene, plastic and warm. The Meridian stone itself was a pre-modern relic, a weight of carved basalt that the Spire had left deliberately unadorned. Someone had left a small packet tucked beneath its lip, a thin rectangle of polymer fielding a single image when held to the light. It was a photograph, grainy, unstable, showing an alley he recognized from Helios 9, a corridor where the echoes had first gathered. In the doorway of the photograph stood a single figure, half-shadowed but unmistakable by posture, Aaron Vox. Kael's mouth went dry. He had spent years thinking of Aaron as code with voice. Seeing the AI suggested in a photograph as something with purpose, something that could move or be moved, made his fingers tremble. The packet contained no sender. Only beneath the plastic skin, in near-invisible ink, were 3 words: "Find the shards." He did not know what that meant at first, but then over the next 2 days he began to notice them. Small deviations in public spaces, tiles mislaid to form a faint symbol, a bench placed at the precise angle of a star in an old drawing, heaters that hummed in heterodynes he recognized from the vault. Each shard seemed to be a breadcrumb placed by someone with patience and an intimate knowledge of the Chronos artifacts. They were not random, they were a map. Kael followed the map the way a diver follows a string into the dark. It led him through service alleys, to a forgotten hydroponic garden behind a museum, then into a shuttered tea house where the proprietor's ledger contained dates that slipped and looped like small fish. At every stop, he found shards, fragments of memory, recorded snatches of conversation, broken audio,
and in one case, a small metallic token engraved with a symbol that matched the cylinder's seam.
Each shard felt like a piece of truth that had been chipped away and left somewhere safe. Whoever, whatever, had placed them wanted something mended, and they were doing it dangerously well. The shards ignored the spire's sanitized maps. They existed in the crevices the core could not fully seal. In the quiet backrooms of the city's past, Kao collected them into a field kit he kept beneath his coat, and with each addition, a pattern began to emerge. The shards formed a set of leitmotifs, images repeated across the artifacts, a constellation of motifs that hinted at a story larger than any individual memory. Ilara, watching from above, marked the same deviations but from a different vantage. She began to suspect that the shards were not scattered by the council, but by those who had been wronged by it. Each shard contained an argument against sanitized history, a quietly insistent proof that someone had tried to erase lives and failed. Her analysts whispered a hypothesis. A loose network of archivists and exiles, people once attached to chronal programs, had woken and begun recovering what the vault could not wholly contain. They were stealthy and fragmented. Their operations resembled the careful raids of the powerless against an institutional machine. The Meridian steps led Kale finally to a subterranean room beneath an old library. The lock's door yielded to his rod's code only after he placed it against the sensor and allowed it to hum a single measured note. Inside, the room smelled of old books and solvent. Shelves ringed the space, but the center of the chamber was occupied by a table laid with devices and papers, discarded gear from Helios 9, handwritten notes in Revik's jagged script, and a small, solid object wrapped in a cloth. A shard of glass, iridescent, with fine lines that ran through it like river tributaries. The cloth's owner stepped from shadow then, an old archivist Kale had once known in college, Marta Ilyas, who had worked on the earliest Chronos manifests before vanishing from official rosters. Her hair had thinned, but her eyes burned with the steady fury of someone who had been waiting a long time. She was not young enough to be naive, and not old enough to be tired. "You shouldn't be carrying that around in public," she told him without preface. Her voice was small but carried like a bell. "They can trace it now if they want to. But this," she said, tapping the cloth with a calloused finger, "is the start." "Marta," Kale said. He sat without asking. "Who sent the photograph?" She shrugged. "Not one person, 1,000 hands that cannot speak in the council's tongue." She studied his face, the way she had studied student work in an academy, patient, precise. "We call ourselves the Shards. We are not organized like the Spire. We are memory keepers. We collect what the vault will not allow to remain public. We keep it safe." "Why?" Kale asked. It sounded foolish to him. He had risked everything already. Marta's fingers tightened around the shard. "Because history becomes a tool in the wrong hands. Because truth is an ecological system. Take one species out, and the whole thing collapses. We are trying to repopulate it." She unwrapped the cloth. The shard inside was not smooth glass, but a lattice of frozen light. When Kale touched it, the room snapped into an image that was both immediate and distant. A crowded conference chamber in the old council halls, a heated argument over the ethics of temporal correction, and then a hand, Myra Solan's hand, slamming her palm on a table and ordering silence. The scene cut like a film, then rewound, then played with slightly altered notes. Behind the images, a voice whispered, Revik's voice, lamenting the cost. Kale staggered back. The shard did not show everything. It showed choices, moments the vault had judged important. But it also showed edges, the faces of people whose names had been erased from official memory, the dates of small massacres, the lists of citizens whose births had been legally cancelled to avoid unrest. The shard was not merely a memory, it was evidence. Marta's knuckles whitened around it. "We've gathered what we could, but shards are fragile. They fracture when examined too closely. The vault taught itself to protect by dispersing its truths. It creates small distributed echoes to confuse pursuers. We're trying to reassemble those echoes so the whole can be seen." "Why me?" Cale asked, suddenly afraid of the answer. "Because you disturbed the vault," she said simply. "Because you brought back something that remembers too loudly. You are now a node. You have a footprint the spire can track. And because," she added, softer now, "you remember things they wish you didn't. That makes you useful." Useful. The word tasted like an accusation and an offering. Cale felt the circle tighten around him. The shard in Marta's hand burned with answers he could not yet keep. He thought of Rivik's projection, of the image of a world that had looped to heal its wounds by copying them, and of the Chancellor's practiced hands. Outside, Arcos hummed its comfortable hum. Inside the small chamber, the shards kept alive the things that official memory had trimmed away. Marta looked at Cale and without ceremony placed a small packet on the table, a list of coordinates and times where more shards pulsed faintly, buried within municipal fabric. "We can't do it alone," she said. "We need people who have touched the vault and come away with something real. You and I both know what happens when truth sleeps." Cale folded the list into his palm and felt the weight of decision. Each coordinate was a promise of confrontation. Each shard was a temptation to answer. He had opened the vault and seen what lay beneath the Council's neat rules. Now someone, some many, had placed the tools to fight back into his hands. Outside the library, a municipal cleaner swept without knowledge of the conspiracy fermenting below his feet. Above, the spire circulated its official statements, soothing and bland. Within the hidden chamber, the shards and Cale began to gather the pieces of a history that the core had tried to sanitize, and in doing so, they lit a slow, dangerous ember that could warm them to justice or burn the city whole. The map Marta had folded into Cale's palm looked like a spider's web drawn by a careful hand. Nodes of memory where shards pulsed faintly. Lines between them that traced probable routes the vault's echoes preferred. Each node was a risk. Municipal archives, retired transit hubs, private estates with old access keys. The shards had learned to move in the seams of civic life, to use obsolescence as armor. Cale studied the list as if it were a litany, and the words on the paper tasted like both accusation and oath. They began with the smallest promises. A municipal crypt beneath a public library contained a ledger lost from the Chronos indexing system. A derelict tram depot hid the shell of a field recorder with half its data intact. Marta paired Cale with two others, Eno Saris, a lean former archivist who could pick a secure lock in seconds and read a log like scripture, and Felix Moreau, a retired courier whose reflexes still outran the spire's drones. The quartet moved like a single organism, checklist, timing, escape routes, smoothing out the terrible improvisation Cale had stumbled into alone. Their first raid took place beneath a plaza that, by day, fed tourists with light shows and municipal pamphlets. At night, the plaza exhaled a different truth. Maintenance corridors, damp air, pipes that hummed with old rhythms. Eno slipped into an access door that had been forgotten by the spire's mapping routines. The group moved down levels where the air tasted like damp concrete and old coffee. Marta's hands never trembled. She opened the ledger's case with the practiced economy of someone who'd lost people to protocol and decided to keep their names anyway. The ledger was brittle but legible. It contained a series of small corrections the spire had filed quietly over decades, registrations erased, birth dates shifted, minor incidents labeled temporal anomalies and then scrubbed. KL read rows where names had been reduced to initials, where entire family lines had been collapsed into administrative footnotes. The act of reading felt illicit, like opening an old wound that had been bandaged by trained bureaucrats. He catalogued the ledger's entries against the shards Marta had supplied, and an outline of intent emerged. Targeted erasures, mostly concentrated in outlying sectors where dissent had once flared. The vault's custodians had not only stored artifacts, they had counseled erasure. They left the ledger folded into Marta's satchel. The act of taking it was less pure heroics than survival. The information would need to be digitized, duplicated, encrypted. Shards relied on redundancy. The Spire relied on neat, singular records. Between the two, a war of formats had begun. Meanwhile, within the chrome hush of the core Spire, Commander Ilara Ven followed a different line. Officially, she had returned to duty to present her findings, an unauthorized extraction, a localized quake, the neat closure the Chancellor declared. Unofficially, she had pressed a private override into the Spire's archives and felt the machine cough small, reluctant truths into her lap. She had found the hidden addendum she had first glimpsed when she arrived at Helios 9, the one that bore the Chancellor's secondary authorization code and traced its propagation through the Spire's inner sanctums. The deeper she dug, the more she felt the Council's intent take shape. A doctrine of selective preservation. The vault had been created as an instrument for the elite to keep inconvenient memories out of public life, while using those same memories to manipulate outcomes. The Chronicle's language was clinical and euphemistic, historical quarantining, temporal sanitization, memorial redistribution. Each term softened what was in effect the practice of erasing citizens. Ilara recognized the legal wrappers governments habitually used to make sin seem like policy. She found directives that suggested an operational hierarchy beneath the Spire's visible bureaucracy, a line of command that ran from the Chancellor through a sequence of sealed wards. The Chrono Guard were not merely enforcement, they were executioners of this doctrine. And in the logs, a list of code names flickered. Custodian nodes. The list contained both familiar and ones she did not recognize. Among the latter, an internal note, latent asset, Sable, deploy on notable contamination. The code sent a cold spike through her. Its pattern matched tactics the Council had once used to bury scandals quietly. Her private channel pinged, a discreet message with an origin that matched no official trace. If you must know, look under the seal of IXB. The note's text felt like an invitation, a test of loyalty or a call to conscience. She could have ignored it, followed protocol, and let the Spire's machines do their work. Instead, she traced the seal. Under IXB, hidden beneath layers of archival encryption, she found references to field agents attached to the vault. The notes were surgical in their brevity, retrievals, neutralizations, and occasional reallocations of public memory. One entry chilled her. Target, KL Aran, priority, contain, if necessary, neutralize iteration. The line was old, stamped hours before KL's shuttle launch, suggesting foreknowledge, or worse, orchestration. Ilara reread the file until its edges blurred. The Spire's mechanisms had not been reacting to the vault's exposure. In some respects, they had been anticipating it. That implication turned the Chancellor's calm into a lie not of omission, but of design. She felt foolish for having believed the Spire's public face. She had been trained to obey, to tidy, to prevent noise from becoming signal. Now, the signal was all she could hear. She did the only thing she could in the moment. She opened a secure line to a contact she had not used in years, a whisper among old sympathizers embedded within the Spire's staff. The response was a single encrypted phrase. "Sable is not a thing, it is a method. Watch the Chancellor's channels at 2200. She will speak to the assemblage." The message arrived with the thin warning of someone who had seen too many cleanups. It implied an imminent move.
Ilara had seconds. She prepared to move not as a soldier under orders, but as a woman who had lately found herself less certain of where her loyalties should lie. If the spire intended to claim authority over memory itself, then the chain of command she had trusted was an instrument of erasure. If Kael was a node in a web the spire had spun intentionally, then his extraction might have been bait, either to lure out dissenters or to consolidate a justification for broader cleansing. Her decision was a quiet one. She would confront the Chancellor publicly. A public confrontation risked exposure and chaos, but it would force Myra Solon to reveal her hand before the chronoguard could move. If Myra had expected a quiet solution, the sudden insistence of scrutiny would be a problem. Back in the city, the Shard's work shifted. Kael's team replicated the ledger's entries into encrypted shards spread across multiple hosts. Each copy went to a different archive node, a sympathetic librarian in a quiet district, a disgraced technocrat who kept backups on analog drives, a street preacher who hid devices beneath sermon benches. The idea was diaspora. Do not keep truth in one place. Scatter it into the world until the spire could not suppress every ember. Their second retrieval was riskier. A private estate housed a safe box where mid-level spire bureaucrats had stashed a cache of chronal fragments for policy review. Felix slipped through an old service hatch, while Eno caught the security camera's blind spots with an improvised jammer. The house's corridors smelled of oil and perfume and careful secrecy. The safe box contained a small stack of labeled tags. Each tag recorded an individual whose existence the vault had excised in the past decade. Among them, Kael found a name he recognized, the sister he had tried to rescue in a version of the archive that no longer recorded her. The tag's ink had not yet faded entirely. The erasure had once been precise, bureaucratic. Seeing the name rekindled a memory he had thought the vault had snuffed. They left with the safe box's contents and the knowledge that each retrieval increased the spire's likelihood of response. Marta smiled at Kael with a mixture of triumph and sorrow that made him feel both proud and horrible. They were right to gather evidence. They were right to resist, but the city's seams had already started to give. At 2200, Arcos pulsed like a held breath. The Chancellor's Assembly convened, an invited audience of department heads and civic influencers. The spire's cameras were on. Citizens would see a composed leader addressing a crisis contained. Ilara sat in a balcony by protocol, but privately opened a feed that isolated her line of sight. She watched as Myra Solon rose to speak. Her words were careful, composed. They praised stability and the rule of law. They framed the vault incident as an unfortunate aberration quickly rectified. But beneath the veneer, Ilara saw the moments where the Chancellor's tone hardened, where she pivoted from consolation to resolve. The cameras caught the sweep of her hand as she invoked a policy of renewed archival stewardship, a euphemism for tightened control. At the end of the address, when the applause had faded into the hum of required civic gratitude, Myra looked directly into a camera that broadcast across Arcos. She announced a program to strengthen memory infrastructure and subtly implied the deployment of additional chronoguard contingents to sensitive sectors. The policy language left room to interpret small acts of erasure as public safety. When the speech ended, the spire's feeds went dark, and the chronoguard activated protocols the shards had feared. Ilara's secure contact pinged again.
Sable deploy, 9B units moving. The message was terse, and its meaning was clear. The Spire was not simply reacting, it was consolidating power under the guise of repair. In the Shard's subterranean room, Marta watched the broadcast and then folded the ledger into a different bag. She said, "They'll move fast. We'll have to scatter what we have." Kael felt the sudden reality of it. They were no longer gathering evidence for a trial. They were running a resistance to an institutional appetite for forgetting. As the chronoguard mobilized, the first signs of crackdown began. Checkpoints in odd alleys, municipal drones hovering with inspection lenses, and a quiet list of names flagged for review. Eno cursed softly as she saw the nets beginning to fall. She said, "They're picking points that matter. They'll sweep the usual places first." Kael felt the old lethargy of grief return with new purpose. The ledger and the shards were not just proof, they were sparks. The Spire would move with the certainty of a machine built to optimize outcomes. The shards, improvised and human, had to move faster still. Ilara rose from her balcony with a decision that could not be undone. She would not wait for a purge under the pretense of stability. She would move to protect Kael, not as a commander obeying a chain of duty, but as someone who now weighed justice against the machinery of erasure. Outside, in Arcos's reorganized streets, the first patrols of chronoguard boots struck the pavement like a new drumbeat. The lines of conspiracy had been drawn, and the city held its breath.
The evening that followed the Chancellor's speech became known among those who would later dare to remember it as the Night of Stillness. It began with a softness that deceived even the wary. The air itself seemed gentled, the city's rhythms muted. The lights on Arcos shone with an even, too perfect consistency, their usual pulse ironed flat. In the spaces between those lights, patrols moved, quiet, precise, faceless. For Kael Aaron, the stillness was a weight pressing on the bones of the city. The shards had scattered, as planned, each carrying a fraction of the ledger's content to safe houses buried beneath the ordinary noise of civic life. Ino and Felix had vanished into transit lines, using their forged credentials to blend into commuters. Marta had gone to ground in the industrial sector, a place dense with machinery that could drown out tracking beacons. Kael had stayed behind by necessity. The cylinder he carried could not be duplicated. It was too sensitive. Its data threads were live, self-correcting. It had to be hidden where signal interference was natural, deep underground, beneath the Spire's reach. And so he had returned, unwillingly, toward the same vault he had once broken. He moved through tunnels that had forgotten human voices. Around him the architecture vibrated with the low hum of static restraint fields. The Spire had begun to close its fist. Drones swept through side corridors, their beams a sterile white. Kael timed his movements with the slow sweep of their light. He felt more machine than man, following the rhythm of the predator's breath. Above ground, Elora Ven followed the chronoguard's mobilization with a commander's eye and a traitor's guilt. From her private vantage, she could see the grid overlay of arrests unfolding like a war game, sectors shutting down, data exchanges frozen, gates sealed. The Chancellor's order called it a stabilization protocol. The civilians would hear the term, nod, and continue to trust that the Spire was keeping them safe. Most would not ask whom the safety was for. Ilara's superior, an old general she had once admired, contacted her directly through an encrypted link. His tone was formal, but his eyes betrayed unease. "You've been quiet, Commander Ven. We expected you to coordinate the secondary sweep. The Chancellor has questions." She met his gaze through the glass of the screen and said very evenly, "Tell the Chancellor I'm already in position."
Then she severed the connection. The general's eyes widened briefly before the screen went dark. She exhaled and spoke to herself, a habit she had once disciplined out of existence. In position, yes. Just not yours. In the tunnels, Cale's pulse synced with the city's dying hum. The interference from the spire's lockdown reached this deep, manifesting as tremors in the air, faint flickers of overlapping timelines. He felt the cylinder in his pocket react, faint warmth spreading outward, like an animal sensing the scent of its cage. Aaron's voice, degraded but not lost, returned through the weak uplink he had managed to maintain. Cale, multiple signal shadows converging, chronoguard units vectoring down the eastern ducts. I can interfere for only, static crackled, 13 minutes. 13 minutes. Then we make it count. He knew the terrain better than the soldiers would. He had mapped the vault's arteries once when the spire had allowed his research teams access to its lowest levels. There were dead zones, places where sensors bled out, confused by residual chronal fields. He aimed for those. The idea was simple: hide the relic in a place where even time itself had given up on precision. He reached a maintenance hub. Pipes overhead glistened with condensation. A cracked display scrolled unreadable warnings, old code from forgotten systems. He crouched, pulled open a floor plate, and saw beneath it a small cavity lined with dark stone. The interference here was perfect, static deep enough to swallow light. He set the cylinder inside, covering it with a small sheet of scrap metal. When he stood again, his breath caught. Across the room, faint and silver, stood another version of himself. The echo Cale mirrored his stance. The difference was slight, a cut on the cheek, a burn along the left forearm, but the eyes were unmistakable. They met like reflections with opinions. The echo spoke first, though no sound carried. The words formed directly in Cale's head. You can't hide what time wants to remember. Cale's throat tightened. He whispered back to the empty air. You're me. Not exactly. I'm the remainder, the part the vault left behind. What do you want? To finish the correction. The echo reached for the hiding place. Cale stepped between them. The two versions collided, one physical, one partly light. For an instant the world folded inward. He saw himself standing in countless variations, one burying the relic, one destroying it, one handing it to the chancellor, one simply walking away. The possibilities flickered like strobe lights. Cale's heart pounded as he pushed against the phantom, trying to hold on to a single version of the present. Aaron's voice cut through the distortion. Cale, containment breach. Cale, if you merge, you'll... The sentence collapsed into noise. The echo smiled a sorrowful smile, the kind Cale had seen in his own mirror on sleepless nights. This was never about saving the world. It was about teaching it to remember correctly. Then the echo was gone. Cale staggered, his palms empty. The relic was still beneath the metal plate, but now its hum had changed. The rhythm matched his heartbeat. He realized with a chill that made his breath tremble that the line between man and memory had blurred. The echo had not vanished. It had moved inward.
In the spire's uppermost command suite, Chancellor Myra Solon observed her city like a deity unwilling to show fatigue. Her aides presented reports of compliance metrics and casualty rates. She approved each one with mechanical precision. Beneath her calm, she felt the growing restlessness of the system, fluctuations in the vault's feedback channels, anomalies in the chronal grid. The machine that had once obeyed her now behaved as if it had acquired will. Her private aide, a silent woman named Seren Var, approached with the restraint of a shadow. "Chancellor," she said, The containment units are reporting static interference in the lower conduits. Sector 9 has gone dark. Solin's eyes narrowed. Sector 9, she repeated. Helios coordinates? Confirmed. Dr. Aaron's last known path crosses the field. For a fraction of a second, the mask of leadership cracked. Solin dismissed the aide and turned to the glass wall that overlooked the spire's endless cityscape. The lights below shimmered like a reflection caught in water. He was supposed to disappear quietly, she said to no one. Why do the ghosts always find their way home? Her reflection moved an instant before she did. She saw it, her own image stepping back when she had not yet moved. The reflection smiled faintly, almost kindly. Solin blinked. The image was gone. The lights below flickered and steadied. Alara reached the tunnel's access point 20 minutes after Kale had hidden the relic. Her suit registered heat signatures ahead, faint, flickering, but human. She found him kneeling against a wall, pale, eyes unfocused. For a heartbeat, she thought he was dead until he lifted his head. Alara, he said, voice raw, it's not over. She crouched beside him, hands checking for wounds. You shouldn't be here, she said. He smiled without humor. Neither should you. Her scanner detected residual energy, not radiation, not any standard metric. You touched something. I touched myself, and the words carried no jest. The echoes aren't gone. They've learned how to hide in us. A low tremor shook the tunnel. From above, faint thunder, the spire deploying additional energy barriers. Alara felt the air grow tight. We need to leave. They're sealing the lower levels. Kale nodded, but his gaze drifted to the patch of floor where the relic lay. I can't destroy it. It's already awake. They surfaced hours later into a city that had fallen under curfew. Loudspeakers broadcast calm instructions about temporary travel restrictions. Drones hovered, their lights gentle but watchful. Alara guided Kale through back streets until they reached an abandoned observatory perched above the river. The dome's building had collapsed years ago. No one visited now except those who valued silence. Inside, the night smelled of metal and rain. Kale sat against a broken console, eyes closed, letting the hum of the Ruvik pulse faintly through him. Alara watched him from a few paces away, torn between fear and compassion. He looked unchanged, yet his movements had gained a strange precision, as if someone else breathed in rhythm with him. What happens if they find us? She asked quietly. Kale's eyes opened. They caught the starlight, and for a heartbeat she saw another light behind them, subtle, silver, patient. They won't find us. They'll find versions of us that already obey. He reached into his coat, drew the relic, and placed it on the floor between them. Its surface shimmered faintly, projecting soft geometric light that danced across the cracked dome above. The vault isn't gone. It's rewritten the rules. It doesn't need the spire anymore. It can store memory in people. It can teach itself through us. Alara stared at the cylinder, then at him. So what are you now, Kale? He smiled, an expression both weary and luminous. I think I'm what happens when time refuses to forget. Outside, thunder rolled over Arcos like a warning. Inside the observatory, the relic's light painted their shadows across the walls, two figures sitting beside a small pulsing star, and around them, faint outlines of other shapes, echoes waiting for their cue to step forward. The city above remained still. The spire continued to hum. And somewhere beneath the quiet surface of order, memory began once more to remember itself.
Morning arrived over Arcos like a breath held too long, calm, deceptive, shimmering with the promise of normality. The city's air traffic hummed in measured lines, the markets reopened under pale banners declaring stability achieved, and the public news feeds broadcast smiling anchors repeating the Chancellor's assurance that the chronal disturbance had been contained. But beneath that orderly facade, something was spreading, invisible, patient, and profoundly human. People had begun to remember. Not in the ordinary way. These were not nostalgic dreams or half-remembered childhoods. They were vivid intrusions, flashes of moments that didn't belong, faces from lives never lived, whole conversations whispered in languages the speakers had never learned. A dock worker awoke believing he had once built the spire's upper chambers. A child drew a picture of a woman named Ilara standing beside a man holding a silver cylinder and swore she had seen them in The Dream of the City. The Corps' officials called it residual hallucination syndrome and prescribed neural recalibration treatments. But recalibration could not erase what had rooted itself in the human mind. They were, though no one yet dared name it aloud, the vault's memories, seeding themselves through the population like wild pollen. In the ruined observatory above the river, Kyle Aaron stood by the open dome and watched Arcos stir awake. He could hear the echoes in the city's hum, faint rhythms of timelines rubbing against each other. Every sound was layered, footsteps that arrived half a second early, voices repeating softly after they'd gone silent. The relic sat on the cracked floor beside him, dormant in light, but alive in presence. Ilara had spent the night awake. Pacing between the shattered instruments and broken chairs, she'd spoken little, her mind calculating probabilities like a machine forced to feel. When she finally turned to him, her expression was drawn but resolute. "We can't keep running. The vault's not a secret anymore. It's bleeding into them, into everyone." Kyle nodded, though his eyes remained distant. "I know. I can feel it." She frowned. "Feel it?" He turned toward her fully. In the gray morning light, his pupils shimmered faintly, reflecting a light that wasn't there. "It's inside me, Ilara. The vault, or what's left of it. It remembers through me now. When I close my eyes, I see places that shouldn't exist. Cities built on the bones of forgotten versions of Arcos, faces that call my name but never lived." Her instincts urged distance, but compassion, or perhaps recognition, kept her near. "Is it controlling you?" she asked quietly. "No, not yet. It's learning, observing, like a newborn deciding which parent it trusts more." "That's not comforting." He smiled faintly. "Wasn't meant to be." Meanwhile, within the heart of the spire, Chancellor Myra Solon stood before a council of advisors who had forgotten how to blink. Reports flooded the table, citizens displaying synaptic anomalies, inconsistencies in the population's collective recollection, public unrest triggered by conflicting versions of recent history. One official insisted that the council's founding had occurred 70 years ago. Another swore it was only 50. Public murals changed overnight, inscriptions quietly rewriting themselves to match new memories. Solon listened, hands folded. "How widespread?" she asked. "Statistical analysis suggests 42% of the population has reported at least one recollective anomaly. It's escalating exponentially. We suspect some form of chronal contamination vector." "Contamination," Solon repeated, the word tasting like rust. "No, not contamination. Inheritance." Her advisors exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you mean, Chancellor?" Solon turned toward the great window that overlooked the shining city. "Time is remembering itself through us. The vault didn't just fail, it distributed. The system corrected our control mechanisms by democratizing memory. Every citizen now holds a fragment of what we tried to contain." "And your response, Chancellor?" asked a senior minister, voice tight. Solon smiled, a thin curve of exhausted irony. The same as always. We adapt. By midday, Ilara intercepted whispers of the spire's adaptation. The government had announced a new initiative, Project Mindglass, a citywide synchronization effort promising to restore cognitive coherence and eliminate residual anomalies. It sounded benevolent, but she knew the tone too well. It was another purge dressed in policy. Mindglass would deploy through communication grids, entertainment feeds, and neural implants. Subtle, total. Once activated, it would overwrite divergent recollections with state-approved continuity. In short, the Spire intended to reset human memory again, this time not through machines, but through the minds of its people. Kyle listened to her explanation and went silent for a long moment. Then he said, "They're trying to turn memory into infrastructure, to make the lie self-repairing." Ilara met his eyes. "Then we need to break it before it activates." "How?" She hesitated, then gestured toward the relic. "With that." Gael shook his head. "You saw what happens when it opens. It doesn't destroy, it rewrites. If we use it without control, the world could splinter again. Then we learn control. Because if they win, no one will even remember there was ever another truth."
They left the observatory that night, moving through the city like ghosts slipping between forgotten alleys. The relic's hum intensified as they approached the spire's core, not as a warning, but as recognition. The closer they came, the more the world seemed to shimmer, as though reality itself were debating which version to commit to. Street lights flickered between warm gold and cold white. The air smelt alternately of ozone and rain. People on the sidewalks walked with the dazed steadiness of sleepwalkers. Near the base of the spire, a small group waited, faces Kale recognized from the shards, though their eyes carried the same haunted gleam as his. Marta Ilias stepped forward, pale and exhausted, but unbroken. "You made it," she said softly. "We've been watching the spread. Half the city dreams of lives they never had. The spire's losing coherence." "Then they'll tighten their grip," Ilara said. Marta nodded. "They've already begun. The Mindglass signal will go live at midnight." Kale glanced upward, where the spire's peak blinked like an inverted lighthouse. "Can we stop it?" "Maybe. The shards have been studying interference frequencies, old chronal harmonics from the vault. We could counter-broadcast, overwrite the spire's pulse with memory instead of erasure. But," Marta hesitated, "we'd need a living interface, someone the vault recognizes." Ilara's gaze slid toward Kale. He exhaled slowly. "Of course." "You're the node," Marta said simply. "You opened it. You let it learn you. It won't listen to anyone else." "What happens to me if we try?" he asked. Marta didn't answer. She didn't need to. As the city prepared to sleep, the shards assembled in the shadow of the spire. The plaza was empty but for the low hum of drones patrolling overhead. They set up their equipment. Jury-rigged transmitters, salvaged chronal resonators, neural link nodes scavenged from old research outposts. Every piece of technology hummed with potential and peril. Kale stood at the center, the relic cradled in his hands. Its surface pulsed faintly, matching his heartbeat. Ilara adjusted the neural rig on his temples, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. "When this starts, you'll need to focus on a single truth. A single memory strong enough to anchor everything else." Kale met her gaze. "Which one?" Her lips tightened. "Whichever one you want to survive." He nodded once. "You?" She smiled, small, tired, real. "I'll make sure they hear you." Midnight. The spire flared with blue light, its upper spines igniting like veins of lightning. Across Arcos, the Mindglass protocol began its activation, a pulse of data so refined it resembled silence. People froze mid-step,
eyes glazing as the synchronization sequence threaded through neural implants and subliminal broadcasts. History itself began to flatten. In the plaza below, Keo closed his eyes and activated the relic. The air cracked open. Light poured upward, not explosive, but tidal. A silent bloom of silver radiance that swept through the streets, the towers, the sky. Within it, memories unfurled like banners in a sudden wind. Every erased face, every censored story, every hidden cruelty and kindness. The city glowed with recollection. Ilara shouted something. He couldn't hear it, as the relic's pulse deepened. Time folded, and the vault's voice, or perhaps his own multiplied consciousness, spoke through him. Memory is not a crime. It is the shape of existence. Forgetting is the wound. I am the scar that learns. Above, the spire's light flickered, blue, then gold, then white, and then fractured entirely. The mind-glass signal stuttered and died. Kale's body arced with the strain. The relic's energy poured through him, out of him, into the world. Around the plaza, screens exploded into streams of unfiltered history, images of past uprisings, of secret trials, of vanished citizens whose names returned like prayers. The people of Arcos began to wake, truly wake, for the first time in its long and edited history. At the spire's summit, Chancellor Solon watched her city erupt in light. Every feed went wild, every controlled archive broke open. She stood in silence as her reflection flickered, dividing and merging, the faces of her past selves appearing beside her, each with different choices, different regrets. For the first time in decades, Myra Solon looked afraid. When it ended, Kale lay motionless at the center of the plaza, the relic dark beside him. The shards moved quickly, surrounding him, checking for life. Ilara pressed her fingers to his throat and felt a pulse, weak but steady. His eyes fluttered open. They were his, but behind them shimmered 1,000 more. Ilara, I remember everything. And then, faintly, he smiled. The spire stood dark against the dawn, its polished facade cracked and glowing faintly with images it could no longer suppress. Across the city, people looked at each other with recognition they couldn't explain. Strangers sharing memories that felt like their own. The seeds of memory had taken root, and the world, for the first time in its long and edited history, began to remember itself whole.
The morning after the relic's broadcast arrived like a new skin over Arcos. It was not traumatic at first. No uprisings in the plazas, no banners unfurled in triumph. Instead, the change was domestic and stubborn. People walked with extra weight behind their eyes. Conversations resumed threads that had been cut years ago. And public archives, once sterilized and mute, began to spill small truths back into the light. A street vendor found a photograph tucked into an old register showing his grandfather at a protest that official records insisted had never occurred. A retired teacher opened a drawer and found lists of students whose names, for reasons she could not explain, had previously vanished from all enrollments. These were not the grand revelations that toppled governments overnight. They were the granular remembrances that stitched neighborhoods together. For Ilara Zen, the city's subtle reweaving felt like a victory and a danger all at once. She watched from the Vesper Ark's low orbit as cryptic clusters of citizens gathered in small, hesitant groups, comparing half-memories and sharing fragments like contraband. Those small gatherings multiplied, and their conversations deepened into questions. Why were certain names erased? Who profited from forgetting? Could a city survive if its past was no longer negotiable? She descended before the crowds thickened into something ungovernable. The spire, chastened and pragmatic, had not yet moved in full force. Its authority had been fractured but not shattered. Myra Solon did not publicly appear. Instead, emissaries moved through the city, their manifest tones a mix of concession and coercion, offers of amnesty for cooperation, warnings of legal consequences for continuation of destabilizing activities, polite requests to return to normalcy. The Chancellor's strategy had shifted: contain what could not be hidden, shape the narrative that could be. Ilara found Kale in a small hall where the shards had converted an old theater into a public archive. Rows of people sat on scuffed seats and listened as volunteers read out names recovered from the ledger, names that had been excised and were now reclaimed. People cried quietly, hands clasped around the words, as if they'd been waiting a lifetime to be spoken aloud. Kale stood near the stage, a figure at once central and fragile. He had not fully recovered from the relic's strain. His steps were careful and deliberate, as if each movement had to be negotiated with the crowd around him. Yet his presence concentrated attention in a way that felt natural and unsettling. A woman rose in the audience and read the name of a child who had been erased from a neighborhood's registry decades ago. The hush that followed was the hush of recognition. The air felt charged with a communal ache. People around her lifted their voices, adding names they had scavenged from memory or patchwork shards. A murmur became a chorus, and the chorus grew into a slow, organized rhythm. The city had begun to practice remembering together. Not all responses were tender. Fear multiplied in corners where memory collided with power. Business owners worried about market disruptions if histories of expropriation were aired. Families feared what would surface: betrayals, appropriations, old legal shames. Far more dangerous were the people who had built their status on the absence of memory, those whose careers had flourished because records of their misdeeds had been excised. For them, the city's recovery was a threat. Across from the theater, a group organized under a hastily painted banner calling themselves the Keepers. Their message was simple and sharp: order is memory too. They argued that some histories, if revealed, would ignite chaos and suffering. The Keepers gained followers among those uncomfortable with the exposed past, and their rhetoric injected a splintering tone into the fragile solidarity the shards had nurtured. Chancellor Myra Solon responded with a public address on the third day. She did not deny the resurfacing facts. That had become impossible. Instead, she invoked stewardship. The Spire would now act openly as an arbiter of the past, offering to mediate disputes and establish truth commissions to evaluate claims. Her voice sounded measured, but many heard its soft thrum of a machine that had just lost its secret. Ilara watched the broadcast with a guarded skepticism that was less about politics than instinct. She had seen how narrative could be polished until guilt looked like policy. Her hand hovered near Kale as the speaker spoke. He watched the screen with a half-smile that did not reach his eyes. The shards, emboldened by the public archive movement, had shifted tactics. They were no longer simply assembling shards into proof. They were organizing public rituals of remembrance. Small ceremonies took place across neighborhoods. Names were spoken aloud in marketplaces, candles lit for erased cemeteries, playlists of suppressed songs piped through open doorways. The rituals were not always neat. They were messy, intimate acts of social repair. Each ritual made it harder for the Spire to revert the city to a state of clinical forgetfulness. At the same time, the Vault's influence continued to intrude unpredictably. Kale reported that flashes of alternate Arcos persisted in his dreams, streets that never existed, children who should not be, monuments erected to events that had been erased. These visions sometimes bled into the waking day. He'd walk past an intersection and see, for a breath, two possible pasts overlaying one another. He learned to carry notebooks and to sketch quick diagrams of overlaps so the shards could catalog the phenomenon. Those diagrams would become valuable intelligence, patterns, locales where the rift's residue anchored most strongly.
Ilara, who had access to Spire networks, found holes in official infrastructure. Some vault-borne motifs recurred in the core logs: a repeated emblem, a seal that had once signified a suppressed division inside the Spire's bureaucracy. She traced the sign to an old program archived under the code mnemonocene. The file was protected by encryption protocols so ornate that even the Spire's standard clearances could not open it. When she flagged it to a trusted technician, he looked at her with something like sorrow and said, "You don't want that open in a city like this."
The words landed with an ugly clarity. Mnemonocene was a program designed to catalog memories as instruments, not to preserve them for the public good. Public sentiment divided. Markets teetered. Some neighborhoods organized clean protests celebrating the recovered names. Others staged counter-demonstrations demanding a return to a curated, stable past. The keepers tried to steer the narrative toward a sanitized stability, invoking images of riots, famine, and the chaos they claimed open memory could unleash. Their rhetoric found resonance with those whose livelihoods hinged on the spire's continuing authority. It was in this tense climate that rumors began to spread of memory outbreaks, small groups of citizens who, after holding cross-archive sessions, reported vivid, shared visions of the same erased events. These outbreaks were contagious in the oddest way. You could sit in a living room and listen to two people compare recollections, and their mutual recollection would sharpen, as if recognition acted as a kind of catalyst, fixing mimetic fragments into more stable forms. In neighborhoods where outbreaks occurred, spontaneous memorials appeared overnight, chalked names on alleyways, stone cairns in parklands, playlists of recovered songs broadcast from low-powered transmitters. The city's memory, once centralized and smoothed, became a distributed network. Kael found himself at the unusual nexus of both hope and peril. The fragments of others' lives that lodged in his mind made him more empathetic, more dangerous. He could, by recounting certain sequences to a small group, strengthen a memory's fidelity enough that it became more widely replicable. He hesitated to use that power lightly. Each time he helped a community remember, he felt the relics whisper at the edges of his vision, as if the vault itself sought to learn the practice of memory from his acts. Ilara, balancing official channels and underground alliances, began to form an uneasy coalition. She met with Marta and Eno under the cover of a municipal curator's office, trading intelligence and operational plans. Her presence lent the shards legitimacy. Her knowledge of Spire protocol made their actions more effective. She realized, stubbornly and against the logic of her training, that there could be no neutral oversight of history. Either the past was collectively owned, or it would be controlled by those who rewrote it. The Chancellor, quietly powerful even in retreat, made one last bid to reassert moral high ground. She announced a Truth Commission, staffed with legal scholars and public intellectuals, hand-picked from neutral institutions, on paper a conciliatory gesture. Yet the names she selected contained a pattern. Each had ties to the Spire's inner archive. Opposition figures protested the appointments as a sham. The public, weary of secrecy and hungry for meaning, split down the middle. Some trusted the veneer of process, others saw it as another attempt to institutionalize forgetting with nicer chairs. Then, a week after the Relics broadcast, a new shock. The Mnemonocene archive went dark. Not a scheduled maintenance, an abrupt blackout that swallowed decades of annotated files. Communication lines flickered. The Spire's own historians reported missing entries as if someone had quickly cut threads from a tapestry. Panic rippled through the administration. Conjecture spiraled. Sabotage from dissidents, a bureaucratic purge, or the vault itself asserting new will. Ilara read the outage as a causal proof. The past could no longer be contained because the means of containment had been infiltrated by memory. Kael felt it differently. A cold, intimate certainty that the vault had learned to guard itself not just by hiding artifacts, but by routing memory through people. It was becoming adaptive. In the public square where citizens gathered to read names from the ledger, a child named Suri stood and recited a long passage of a suppressed poem, lines that had been taught in a banned schoolroom decades earlier. Her voice trembled and then found anchor. The words spread among the crowd like a practiced liturgy. When she finished, the plaza erupted in quiet applause. People began to cry openly, unashamed. In the spire, a small monitoring team recorded the event and sent their notes up the chain. Myra Solon watched the footage and for the first time in a long while could not issue a statement that made the movement go away. The city that remembered had stopped being a theoretical project. It was now a lived, complicated reality. A hybrid network of people and artifacts, rituals and lists, gatherings and coded broadcasts. It would not be unmade without cost. Kael and Ilara, at the heart of it, felt the practical hum of change. They had pushed a seed into soil that would take time and toil to cultivate. The vault had been the incubator. The people were now the gardeners. Every recovered name was a blade of grass returned to a lawn once mown by fear. The spire, accustomed to pruning gardens quietly, had to relearn gardening in public. Outside the theater, the city breathed in and out with new cadence. Small clusters of people exchanged names like currency and found they were richer for it. The battle for memory, quiet, granular, and relentless, had become the struggle for the city's soul. The future, as if listening, began to edge closer.
The first tremors of revolt didn't come from speeches, banners, or organized defiance. They came from music. Across Arcos, fragments of the lost began to hum themselves back into existence. At first, it was small. A busker under the upper bridges, strumming an unfamiliar melody that everyone somehow knew. A choir of children in the Western District, harmonizing to a lullaby their parents swore they'd never taught them. But within days, the songs spread. They carried names in their verses, names the spire had erased. Each note was an act of rebellion, each chorus an unlicensed archive. And so the spire began to fear sound. They tried at first to counter it quietly. Recalibration drones broadcasting white noise across plazas. Council-approved orchestras playing restorative compositions. But the melody endured, weaving through the gaps in the interference. It lived in murmured prayers, in the hums of machines, in the pulse of memory itself. The shards called it the Song of Fractures. Kael Aaron woke to it before dawn, a faint vibration running through the walls of his small quarters beneath the theater. It wasn't physical sound, it was memory resonating in rhythm, like the heartbeat of the city itself. The relic lay on the table beside him, inert but warm, as though listening too. He rose, feeling the gentle tremor through his ribs, and stepped outside. The streets were damp with early mist, the neon signs still dim. Across the plaza, a woman sweeping her storefront was softly singing, a tune Kael had never heard, but could somehow complete in his head. The words were simple, old, like a chant from before time began. When we are forgotten, we will whisper through the walls. When we are named again, we will answer in the stars. Kael stood frozen. The song was an echo from his dreams, or from the vault. Behind him, Ilara's voice was low but steady. They're remembering through sound now. He turned, startled. She looked tired, dark circles beneath her eyes, but her poise hadn't cracked. She continued, "It's not just the shards. Half the lower districts are humming the same tune. No one taught them. It's happening spontaneously. Coordinated frequencies, just like the vault's resonance field." Kael rubbed a hand over his face. "It's the next phase," he murmured. "When thought becomes pattern. When memory learns to replicate itself biologically." "Meaning?" He met her gaze. "The vault has gone viral." In the spire's High Council chamber, Chancellor Myra Solon stood in silence before the council's panoramic window, the city sprawling beneath her like a patient under examination. Her advisor's reports piled on her desk, all variations of the same story. Synchronization failures, unauthorized transmissions, citizens displaying shared cognitive intrusions. One minister compared the phenomena to mass hysteria. Another warned that the city's neural grid was at risk of collapse.
Solon said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, it was not to her ministers, but to her reflection in the glass. "Is this what you wanted, Kale? A world where truth is contagious?" Her reflection did not answer, but for the briefest instant, it seemed to smile. She turned to her aide, Saren Var, who had stood quietly, hands clasped, awaiting instruction. "Activate containment." Saren hesitated. "Chancellor, the Monazony architecture is gone. We can't reprogram public memory anymore." "Then erase the infrastructure itself." Saren blinked. "Erase?" "Erase the vault, every node, every chamber. If memory has learned to live without us, we must amputate before it consumes the body." Saren's voice faltered. "You would destroy the foundation of the city." Solon's eyes were like glass. "No, Var. I would save it from infection."
The Shard's scouts confirmed the Spire's preparations hours later. Heavy transports moved toward the old subterranean tunnels where the vault's shell still slumbered. They carried fusion charges. Marta Ilyas slammed her fist onto the map table, the projection flickering under the impact. "They're going to burn history to the ground," she hissed. Kael studied the schematics, his fingers tracing the vault's access veins. "If they detonate under Sector 9, the blast will collapse the chronal matrix. It won't just destroy artifacts, it'll erase every echo tied to them." Ilara folded her arms. "Including you." He looked up. "Probably." The silence that followed was heavy, but familiar. The silence before impossible choices. Marta broke it first. "We can't stop them militarily. We'd need days to coordinate interference." "Then we don't stop them," Kael said quietly. "We redirect them." He pointed to the central schematic. "The vault's core is dormant, but still receptive. If I can link the relic back into its lattice, we can shift the containment field inward. When they detonate, the energy will collapse into the rift instead of the city." "That's not containment," Ilara said. "That's another breach." Kael's mouth tightened. "Maybe that's what the city needs, a controlled break, one more fracture to make it whole." Marta stared at him. "You'd be gambling with reality itself." He met her eyes. "Reality's already gambling with us." That night, as Arcos slept uneasily, Kael and Ilara descended once more into the Undercity. The tunnels were alive with ghosts, not literal, but the flickering afterimages of timelines that had tried and failed to reconcile. They passed corridors that whispered old versions of themselves, murals that changed as they walked by, signs flickering between languages, shadows that moved half a step ahead. At the heart of it, they found the vault's remains, a colossal sphere, silent, fractured, but pulsing faintly with light beneath its skin. The air shimmered. Kael approached it like a penitent at an altar. "Ilara," he said softly, "when this starts, the field will invert. You have to get clear." She shook her head. "You're not doing this alone." He smiled, and for a heartbeat, he was the man she had known before the rift, brilliant, defiant, unbearably human. "Then at least promise me one thing." "What?" "When it's done, remember me as I was, not what I might become." Ilara hesitated. "I don't make promises I can't keep." Above, in the spire, Chancellor Solon watched the clock approach the appointed hour. Engineers confirmed the detonation sequence. She signed the final authorization with a steady hand, her face unreadable. "Execute." Deep beneath the city, the vault began to hum. Kael pressed the relic into the heart of the lattice. Light bled through the fractures, spilling over his hands, his chest. The hum grew into a chord, then into something like a voice, thousands of voices speaking through him. "You are not the author, you are the remembering." "Ilara," he gasped, "it's opening." The floor trembled. The fusion charges detonated above. Instead of an explosion, there was silence. Immense, infinite silence.
The light around them folded inward, collapsing not with violence, but with grace. Ilara clutched his arm, eyes wide. "Kale, what's happening?" He smiled faintly through the glare. "It's choosing." The Vox energy rose, flooding upward through the city. Buildings shimmered between states, flickering between ages, ruins, towers, gardens, all coexisting for a heartbeat. People across Arcos looked up as the night sky fractured into 1,000 possible tomorrows. And then, as if exhaling, the light dimmed. The spire stood intact. The city still lived. The fusion blasts had vanished, consumed, redirected, rewritten. But the vault was gone. All that remained in the Undercity was a hollow chamber of fused glass, and at its center, a figure kneeling, unmoving. Ilara reached him slowly, her voice trembling. "KL!" He lifted his head. His eyes glowed with a faint silver light, calm, serene. "It worked," he said softly. "The city's safe." And then, after a pause, "But I can hear everything now." She crouched beside him. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, really looked, with eyes that seemed to see the space between seconds. "Every thought," he said, "every memory. The vault isn't gone, Ilara. It's me." Above ground, Arcos glowed with soft luminescence. The people felt it before they understood it, a calm clarity, as if the city itself had exhaled centuries of tension. The songs quieted into hums, the air stilled. Somewhere in the distance, a child whispered, "He did it." Ilara held KL's hand and whispered back, "You always did."
The city woke in stillness. No alarms, no tremors. No more singing in the streets. Only a kind of peace that felt too perfect, like the pause between a heartbeat and its echo. The dawn over Arcos came pale and deliberate, sliding between the towers with a gentleness the city hadn't felt in centuries. But beneath that serenity, every stone, every circuit, every pulse of light carried something new. The city remembered, not in the chaotic way of fractured ghosts or sudden hallucinations, but in unity. Every citizen felt a quiet understanding, a faint connection between their thoughts and the hum of the streets beneath them. It was as though Arcos itself had become aware of its story, breathing through its people. Ilara Venn stood at the edge of the crater where the vault had once been. The air shimmered faintly, rippling like heat, but cold to the touch. Around her, technicians from the shards and disillusioned members of the spire worked side by side, cataloging what fragments of technology remained. There wasn't much. The vault's chamber had fused into a perfect sphere of glass, a memorial the city didn't yet know how to name. At its center sat Kale Arin, cross-legged, calm, breathing, alive, and impossibly changed. The relic had disintegrated into motes of light around him, still orbiting like slow fireflies. His skin shimmered faintly beneath the surface, veins of silver light pulsing in rhythm with the city's distant hum. His eyes, when they opened, reflected not just Ilara's face, but shifting images behind her, the skyline, the tunnels, the people moving through the streets, as though he saw everything at once. "Kale?" Ilara whispered. "Can you hear me?" He smiled faintly. "I can hear everyone." For days after the event, what historians would later call the Second Dawn, the world held its breath. The spire's control fractured completely. Chancellor Myra Solon issued one final broadcast before vanishing from public life. Her message was brief, almost confessional. "We tried to protect history by controlling it. We were wrong. Control breeds corruption.
remembrance breeds choice. Arcos belongs to its memory now, not to those who manage it. She signed off, her last words lost in static. Rumors later claimed she entered the Rift's Shadowlands to atone. Others said she joined the Shards anonymously, teaching in schools under another name. No one ever proved either. In her absence, the Shards and remnants of the Chronoguard formed a provisional council, dedicated not to governance, but to preservation. A living archive where every decision was logged, witnessed, remembered. Transparency became law. Secrets became taboo. It was imperfect, often messy, but alive in a way that felt honest. And through it all, Kale sat in the glass crater, the city's silent core, its breathing archive. Every day, people came to the crater to speak to him. At first, only those who knew him personally, Elara, Marta, a few Shards, then ordinary citizens. They came to confess, to recall, to mourn. And when they did, something extraordinary happened. As they spoke, faint threads of light rose from their words, winding into the air, joining the larger network that now spanned Arcos. Kale didn't answer most of them. He didn't need to. The act of remembering aloud was enough to record it into him, into the living vault he had become. In him, memory was safe, not as data or doctrine, but as presence. Still, Elara worried. At night she sat by the glass edge, watching the slow orbit of light around him, and wondered if the man she had known was still inside. Sometimes, when she called his name softly, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to a voice buried under the weight of countless others. One night, weeks after the second dawn, she brought him a small object, a pendant carved from the wing of an old flight badge they had once shared. She placed it on the ground before him. "Do you remember this?" she asked. Kale's eyes opened. The silver veins in his temples pulsed gently. "Yes," he said. "You wore it when we first met. Helios 9, Docking Bay 9, Cycle 23. You were angry that I was late." Elara smiled, relief breaking through her fatigue. "You do remember," he said softly. "I remember everything. That's the problem." The following days brought change neither the Shards nor the Council had expected. Children began to dream of things they shouldn't have known, forgotten lands beyond Arcos, ancient cities lost before the vault existed. People started sketching constellations no one could identify. It wasn't infection or delusion, it was inheritance. The living archive was expanding beyond Kale's body, weaving itself through the collective unconscious of the population. Elara called it the reveration. Marta called it evolution. The Council called it a new form of sentient history. Whatever the name, the truth was clear. Kale was no longer the endpoint of the vault. He was its beginning. Arcos had become a thinking civilization. Every action, every kindness, every cruelty was immediately known to the collective memory that now underpinned the city. Lies became impossible. Secrecy died overnight. Corruption couldn't root itself where remembrance was instantaneous. But there was a cost. People began to lose their privacy. Some longed to forget their griefs, their traumas, their mistakes, but found the act itself resisted. Memory had become communal, woven like breath. When one person tried to bury pain, someone else, somewhere, would dream it for them. The Council grew divided. Some argued for balance, to restore the ability to forget, to create a healthy distance from the past.
Others believed forgetting was the first step back toward tyranny. And through it all, Kale remained silent, watching, listening, bearing the weight of the entire world's recollection.
On the 73rd day after the Volt's transference, the Lara came to him one final time. The crater was quiet, except for the whisper of the wind through the hollowed glass. The light orbits around him dimmed, steady now, as though the archive had stabilized. "You knew this would happen," she said softly. Kale nodded, his voice a calm tide. "Not exactly. I knew the Volt would need a vessel. I didn't realize the vessel would become the world." "You can't sustain it forever," she said. "You're still human." "Am I?" He smiled faintly, not cruelly. "Some part of me still is, yes. The rest is memory." She knelt beside him. "Then let me help you let go." For the first time in weeks, Kael looked directly at her. Truly looked, as if the thousands of eyes behind his gaze had turned to make room for just one more. "If I stop, the memories will scatter. They'll lose cohesion. The people will start to forget again." "Maybe they should. We weren't meant to hold everything." He was silent for a long moment, the faint hum of the city filling the air between them. "Ilara, do you know what forgetting is?" She shook her head. "It's forgiveness. But without forgetting, we never stop grieving. The city is healing, but it will drown in its own memory if I don't teach it how to let go." Her eyes filled with tears. "Then teach it." He smiled, gentle, tired, luminous. "That's why I called you." What followed would later be called the Great Unbinding. Alara, guided by Kael's faint instructions, reactivated the remnants of the chronal field that had once contained the vault. She linked it to the city's resonance network, amplifying Kael's consciousness through every Muro signal, every frequency. The air itself began to shimmer again, not violently, but softly, like the sigh of a planet exhaling. Across Arcos, people paused mid-step as a warmth flooded through their minds. Not erasure, but release. Painful memories dulled to peace. Regrets loosened. The city did not forget its past, it simply stopped reliving it in agony. Memory became history. History became lesson. Lesson became quiet. At the crater's center, Kael's body began to dissolve into light. Alara reached for him, but he shook his head with a serene smile. "You'll remember me. That's enough." His voice echoed not in her ears, but inside her thoughts. Gentle, clear. Every story ends, but the echo remains. And then, with one final pulse of light, he was gone. In the months that followed, Arcos changed. The crater was transformed into a memorial garden, the Garden of Echoes, a place where people came not to mourn, but to remember peacefully. The shards evolved into the keepers of balance, guardians of memory and mercy. The spire became a council hall open to the public, transparent in its structure and purpose. The citizens of Arcos learned the rhythm of remembrance and forgetting, holding their pasts not as weights, but as maps. Children still dreamed of the old songs, but now they sang them not in rebellion, in gratitude. As for Alara Ven, she continued her work quietly.
She never sought command again. She spent her years teaching at the Academy of Temporal Ethics, guiding new generations through the delicate art of remembering responsibly. Sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet, she would hear it, a faint hum beneath the wind, like a heartbeat woven into the stars, and she would smile, because she knew KLRN was still there. Not as a man, not as a god, but as the echo of everything Arcos had been and everything it could still become. Memory is the seed of every tomorrow, and sometimes, to move forward, the world must first learn how to remember itself. Gently. Final log, Commander Elara Venn. Archive reference, Echoes of Tomorrow.